What if the key to peace isn't fixing your circumstances, but mastering your reactions to them? Epictetus believed that the storms of life, loss, betrayal, poverty, illness were never the real problem. The real prison was our refusal to accept what we cannot control, and the real freedom was learning to rule our own mind. Think about the way that lands in your own life. At some point, you've probably told yourself, if I can just fix this one thing, earn more, lose weight, save the marriage, land the promotion, then I'll finally breathe easy. But the relief never lasts, does it? Another crisis arrives, another twist of fate, another reminder that the universe doesn't ask for your permission before it disrupts your plans. Epictetus confronted this hard reality head on. He insisted that the path to peace is not about winning the endless tug of war with circumstances, but about dropping the rope altogether. This idea becomes all the more startling when you realize who is saying it. Epictetus was not born into wealth or comfort. He was not a philosopher teaching from the safety of ivory towers. He was a man who began life as a slave in the Roman Empire, his body broken, his freedom denied. And yet, he declared himself freer than emperors, freer than generals, freer than any man whose peace was chained to fortune. That paradox, that a man with nothing could insist he had discovered everything, still unsettles us 2,000 years later. What gave him this conviction? The boy born in chains grew into a man who understood that while masters could command his labor, they could never command his will. His leg could be twisted until it broke, but his mind could not be bent without his consent. And it was there, in that invisible inner space, that he built a philosophy more resilient than any palace walls. Why does this matter now, in our time, in your life? Because in truth, you are not so different from Epictetus. You may not wear chains of iron, but you know chains of another kind. The mortgage that ties you down, the boss whose moods dictate your days, the relentless pressure of family obligations, the health scare that arrived without warning. Each of these reminds you of how little control you really have. And so, the question Epictetus once posed to himself becomes yours. When so much is outside your control, where will you ground your peace? His answer was radical in its simplicity. Separate what belongs to you from what does not. Your thoughts, your choices, your inner stance, these are yours. Everything else is not. And if you spend your life trying to control what isn't yours, you will never be free. But if you master what is, then nothing, not chains, not loss, not death itself, can take your freedom away. Listen to how sharp that sounds in a modern ear. We live in an age that tells us peace comes from managing everything. Optimize your schedule, master your investments, control your diet, curate your image. Every advertisement promises mastery over circumstances, and every day, life proves the lie. We are more anxious than ever, precisely because we are trying to control what cannot be controlled. Epictetus cuts through the noise with a scalpel. Stop wasting energy on the impossible, and start practicing sovereignty over yourself. Yet, Epictetus does not let us off easy. His message is not comforting in the conventional sense. He does not promise that philosophy will shield you from pain. On the contrary, he insists that suffering is unavoidable. People will betray you, bodies will fail, wealth will vanish, death will come, the storms are guaranteed. But the one freedom you always carry, the one no tyrant can touch, is the power to respond with dignity. And if you learn that, you have already won the only battle that matters. This is the mystery, the paradox, the puzzle of Epictetus. How can someone so deprived claim to have found the ultimate form of wealth? How can a man beaten and owned declare himself freer than the emperor himself? It is a claim so bold that even now it rattles our assumptions about freedom, peace, and what it means to live well. That is the journey this story invites you into. Across the beats that follow, we will walk with Epictetus from the shadows of slavery into the bright light of philosophy. We will watch as he discovers, through pain and limitation, insights that have traveled across centuries to land on our doorsteps today. And along the way, we will test his ideas against our own lives, our own struggles, our own storms. Because this is not just history, this is a mirror. Epictetus is not asking you to admire his resilience from afar. He is challenging you to consider your own chains. What are the things outside your control that you keep trying to master? What prisons have you built for yourself by refusing to accept what cannot be changed? And what might your life look like if you began, finally, to rule your own mind? This opening beat is only the beginning. To understand how a boy born without freedom became the world's great teacher of freedom, we must step deeper into his life, into the foundations that shaped him long before he found words for his philosophy. His childhood was harsh, but it was also the soil in which his wisdom took root. And so we turn now to the beginning, the early years of Epictetus, when the foundations of his thought were laid in silence, suffering, and survival. When we peel back the centuries to glimpse the childhood of Epictetus, we find not a neat story preserved in family letters or childhood portraits, but fragments and silences. Unlike the noble Roman children, whose births were marked by inscriptions and family records, Epictetus entered the world as an enslaved child. His beginnings were not chronicled, because, in the eyes of society, his life did not belong to him, it belonged to his owner. And yet, from that obscurity, he would rise to articulate one of the clearest philosophies of freedom the world has ever known. To understand how, we must examine what it meant to grow up in bondage and how those earliest experiences became the hidden scaffolding of his thought. Hierapolis, the town of his birth in Asia Minor, was a place of stark contrasts. Known for its healing hot springs, it attracted the wealthy and the sick, those who sought physical restoration in mineral baths. To a young Epictetus, this contrast would have been unmissable. The rich arriving in procession to soak their aching bodies in luxury, while enslaved attendants, perhaps including himself and his family, fetched water and carried supplies. For a child, such scenes were not abstract economic lessons. They were daily encounters with inequality. Some people could command leisure while others were commanded. Some people's pain was treated as urgent and worthy of comfort, while others' pain went unnoticed. If philosophy begins with seeing the world clearly, then Epictetus's first philosophy lesson may have been recognizing this brutal asymmetry. But we should linger for a moment on the child's eye view of this world. Imagine a boy who sees others play freely while his own play is interrupted by labor. Imagine him watching his mother respond instantly to a master's voice, no matter what she was doing. Imagine him learning, before he could even form words, that life could change in an instant at the will of another. Children raised in such conditions grow hyper-attuned to shifts in tone, to sudden changes in mood skills of survival that later sharpen into insights about human behavior. When Epictetus later instructed his students to attend not to what people said, but to how they lived, perhaps he was recalling the childhood practice of reading people's faces to know if punishment or safety was near. It is easy, in telling the story of a philosopher, to leap forward to ideas and texts, but the child Epictetus did not yet have concepts like detachment or acceptance of fate. He had the raw experience of being powerless. He saw what it meant to live without guarantees, without assurance that tomorrow would resemble today. This is not a poetic image, it was his reality. That reality carved into him the fundamental Stoic insight: most of life is not in your control. For many of us, this realization comes only in adulthood, in the collapse of plans or the onset of illness. For Epictetus, it arrived with childhood itself. But deprivation was not his only teacher. It is likely that Epictetus encountered philosophy for the first time in his master's household. His owner, Epaphroditus, was a wealthy freedman with ties to the imperial court. Unlike slaves condemned to mines or farms, Epictetus grew up in proximity to literacy, education, and the world of ideas. Perhaps he overheard conversations about politics or philosophy. However it happened, his sharp mind was fed on scraps of knowledge that most children in bondage would never touch. Again, the paradox emerges. The same system that denied him freedom also placed him in the path of philosophy. His enslavement, while brutal, positioned him within reach of the very tools that would one day allow him to articulate freedom. This, too, shaped his outlook. From the beginning, life taught him that blessings are not pure and hardships are not simple. Pain can be the doorway to wisdom, and constraint can be the very place where you discover what cannot be constrained. A child born into this paradox might grow bitter, but Epictetus grew observant. Where others saw only deprivation, he began to notice possibility. The possibility that one's mind remained untouched even when one's body was commanded. Consider how this maps onto the struggles of modern life. Many people today feel that their childhood set traps they are still trying to escape. Family dysfunction, poverty, early loss. These experiences shape us deeply. But Epictetus' story invites us to see them differently. What if those early constraints, however painful, also carried the seeds of wisdom? What if your first encounters with unfairness, with insecurity, with longing, were the very experiences that prepared you to see life more clearly than those who lived only in comfort? For Epictetus, childhood was not a wound to escape. It was the forge in which his philosophy was formed. We must also notice the bodily dimension of his early life. Accounts suggest that Epictetus had a leg injury, possibly inflicted by a master. Some traditions say Epaphroditus twisted it until it snapped, leaving him permanently lame. Whether this occurred in boyhood or later, we cannot be certain, but imagine growing up with a body that did not obey you fully. For most children, the body is their first instrument of freedom, running, climbing, leaping into the future. For Epictetus, the body may have already been a reminder of limitation, and yet this too became part of his philosophy. If the body could be broken, then true freedom must lie elsewhere. He refused to build his peace on what could be twisted, injured, or destroyed. We see here a pattern. Every deprivation of Epictetus's childhood, loss of family stability, lack of social standing, fragility of the body, became fuel for the central insight that only the mind's posture can be secure. Rather than denying these realities, he leaned into them, asking, "If this too can be taken from me, then where must I place my hope?" And each time the answer was the same: within. This childhood foundation also explains why his later teaching carried such weight. His words were not speculative. They were not clever paradoxes spun in leisure. They were distilled from lived necessity. When he told his students that peace is found not in controlling events but in controlling yourself, he was speaking as someone who had survived childhood by practicing that truth daily. His authority was not intellectual but existential. And so, from the early stage of his life, Epictetus was being prepared, not by privilege, not by gentle nurture, but by relentless exposure to the fragility of all things external. Childhood taught him the Stoic lesson before he could name it: fortune is fickle, but the mind can remain free. This foundation carried him into adulthood, where philosophy would give him language for what he had already learned in silence. This sets the stage for our next step. Childhood formed the soil, but family, or its absence, was the seedbed. What did it mean to grow up with parents who were themselves enslaved, whose identities may have been erased from record? How did the silence of family influence shape his later insistence on self-mastery and independence? To answer that, we must turn to the question of family influence, and to how absence itself can become a teacher. The silence around Epictetus's family is more revealing than any detail that history could have preserved. Unlike the great men of Rome, whose genealogies were carved in stone to proclaim their lineage, the enslaved lived without that privilege. Their parentage was treated as irrelevant, their attachments fragile, their names easily erased. For Epictetus, this absence was not an abstract fact. It was the fabric of his life. He was likely born of enslaved parents, perhaps with a mother still bound in service, perhaps with a father lost to sale or scattered elsewhere in the empire. Family, that primal human anchor, was for him uncertain at best and disposable at worst. Out of that precarious beginning would grow a philosophy that insists no external tie, however cherished, can secure your peace. It is tempting to imagine that this absence hardened him into cold detachment, but the evidence suggests otherwise. What emerges instead is a portrait of a man who understood both the sweetness of attachment and its fragility. He does not reject love. He insists we love differently, without possession, without the illusion that we can hold forever what was never ours to command. This was not the conclusion of a theorist reflecting from comfort, but the survival lesson of a boy who may have learned early that those you love most can vanish without warning. Where others saw security in family, Epictetus saw exposure. That realization shaped the core of his teaching: invest your peace only in what cannot be stolen. To appreciate the radical edge of this, consider how family functions in our own time. We build identities around parenthood, around marriage, around bloodlines. We tell ourselves, these ties guarantee belonging, permanence, legacy. And yet, midlife often brings the shock that family does not shield us from impermanence at all. Children rebel or move far away. Parents decline, marriages dissolve, siblings drift. What Epictetus knew as a child becomes our discovery decades later. Family, while precious, is not permanent. His insistence that we ground our peace elsewhere is not a rejection of love, but a recognition of its vulnerability. Imagine, then, the lessons he absorbed from watching his mother, if she was present in his early years, navigate the world of bondage. An enslaved mother raising a child could not afford illusions. She would have known every moment that her child could be sold away, that her love might not protect him. If she loved in defiance of that risk. Such love must have carried both tenderness and steel, and Epictetus may have inherited both. The tenderness that made him a compassionate teacher, the steel that made him insist no human bond can be your foundation. Both may have been first modeled by a mother whose life embodied resilience under impossible conditions. And if his father was absent, whether through sale or death or erasure, that absence too was a kind of influence. Roman society centered the father as the pillar of the household, the one whose authority was absolute. To grow up without one would mean living at the edges of Roman ideals of family. It would mean seeing early that the supposed pillars of life are not guaranteed. Where others placed faith in the permanence of patriarchal authority, Epictetus saw its fragility. Later, when he insisted that freedom must come from within, perhaps he was drawing on this early recognition: the world's supposed anchors are always subject to collapse. This helps explain the tone of his teaching, which was often blunt, almost parental in its directness. His students describe him as stern but caring, never letting them hide behind excuses. He became the father figure he may never have had, guiding others with the authority of one who had learned independence the hard way. His demand that they master themselves was not cruelty. It was the same lesson life had given him when family could not. There is another subtle dimension here. For a child without secure family bonds, identity becomes fragile. Who am I, if not the son of someone? Where do I belong, if not in a household that claims me? Epictetus grew up in a world that denied him both lineage and ownership of self. His later insistence that we find our identity not in external roles but in rational choice can be seen as a response to this void. If he could not locate identity in family, he would locate it in the one thing that could not be taken: the capacity to think, to choose, to assent or refuse within. He forged his selfhood not from inheritance but from reason, and in doing so, offered a model that anyone enslaved or free could adopt. We should not mistake this for bitterness. Epictetus was not a man railing against what he lacked. Instead, he reframed lack as clarity. The absence of family permanence showed him the necessity of inner permanence. The absence of external anchors revealed the possibility of internal anchoring. This is why his philosophy continues to resonate today. It is not a denial of human longing, but a redirection of it. He does not tell us not to love our children or cherish our partners. He tells us to love them knowing they are mortal, knowing they are not ours to keep. Only then, he argues, can we love them fully, without the desperate clutching that turns love into possession. There is a piercing modern relevance here. Many midlife crises are not about career or wealth, but about family disappointments: the child who does not turn out as hoped, the marriage that falters, the parent who dies too soon. We grieve not only the loss, but the broken expectation that family would shield us from loss. Epictetus, shaped by early family instability, strips away that expectation before it can take root. He insists we face reality directly. Nothing external is guaranteed. But rather than despairing, he points to the strange liberation that follows. If you release the demand that family or fortune guarantee permanence, you can finally embrace them as they are, fragile and fleeting, and love them without illusion. This lesson could only have come from someone who knew absence firsthand. His silence about family in his later teachings is telling, not because he dismissed it, but because he refused to romanticize it. He did not build his philosophy on longing for what he lost. He built it on clarity about what can never be secured. And in that clarity, he discovered a deeper way to love, not as possession, but as participation in the fleeting gift of another's life. The influence of family on Epictetus, then, is both presence and absence, tenderness and fracture. It is the resilience of a mother, perhaps, and the silence of a father. It is the awareness that love exists in conditions of risk, and that peace must be grounded in what risk cannot touch. Out of these early conditions, his philosophy took root. Childhood taught him life was unstable. Family taught him love was fragile. Together they carved the foundations for his later insistence: rule your mind, and you can endure anything. From here, his story turns toward the realm of education. If family gave him his first lessons in fragility and resilience, the mentors and teachers of his youth gave him language and form for what he had already learned. His next stage would not be survival alone, but awakening, a discovery that philosophy could be a home when family could not. And it was there, in the teachings of the Stoics, that Epictetus began to find the framework for a life shaped by freedom from within. Education, in the life of Epictetus, was not a luxury or a leisurely pursuit. It was survival refined into wisdom. For most children of Rome's enslaved class, the chance to study letters, to listen to teachers, or to engage with philosophy was unimaginable. But fate, that unpredictable hand, placed him in a household where learning was not only present, but valued. His owner, Epaphroditus, a freedman of the imperial court, was a man of means who surrounded himself with books, tutors, and the discourse of Rome's intellectual elite. For the boy who had grown up in the shadows of dependence and uncertainty, this environment opened a narrow but vital doorway into a world of ideas. We can picture him first as an observer, not a participant. Perhaps he stood at the edges of a room while his master or guests spoke of Stoic philosophy, of law, of the duties of men. Enslaved children were often given the task of serving or waiting in silence. But silence is not absence. Silence can be apprenticeship. He listened, absorbed, memorized the rhythms of arguments. Where others heard noise, he heard patterns. Where others debated casually, he caught glimpses of truths that resonated with the instability of his own life. What made philosophy grip him so deeply was not the cleverness of its debates, but its promise of stability in a world that gave him none. Imagine what it must have meant to a young slave, whose future was dictated by another's whims, to hear Stoics speak of an inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that no one could breach. Philosophy was not entertainment for him, it was lifeline. It offered the possibility that even in chains, he might discover a realm where he could not be mastered. Yet, access to philosophy was never neutral. Education for an enslaved child was a paradox. It could elevate one's usefulness to a master, but it could also awaken a mind to its own dignity. In Epictetus's case, both happened. His intelligence made him valuable, perhaps even indispensable, but it also made him dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that his mind could not be fully contained. Every scroll he glimpsed, every conversation overheard, sharpened his awareness that while his body could be owned, his thoughts could not. This awareness would later become the sharp edge of his teaching. When he told his students that freedom is not granted by citizenship or property, but discovered through mastery of one's mind, he was speaking as someone who had tested this claim in the laboratory of his own youth. His early education was not merely intellectual, it was a daily experiment in seeing how far freedom could extend when circumstances denied it. We should also consider the emotional dimension of his learning. Children often take their first sense of possibility from the voices of parents. For Epictetus, whose family influence was fragmented or absent, education became a surrogate parent. The Stoic tradition, reaching him through lectures and texts, became his inheritance. While others inherited names, lands, and reputations, he inherited philosophy. And because he had little else, he clung to it not as ornament, but as foundation. There is something profoundly modern in this. Many people today who come from fractured backgrounds or unstable childhoods discover in books or mentors the voices that anchor them. A teacher, a coach, a writer's words can become the family they never had. Epictetus embodies this pattern. The Stoics were not simply philosophers to him, they were kin, offering the guidance that blood could not. This explains the paternal tone that would later mark his own teaching. He offered to his students what life had withheld from him, a fatherly voice of discipline, encouragement, and truth. It is telling that Epictetus gravitated most toward Stoicism among the many schools of philosophy available in Rome. Epicureanism promised pleasure, but pleasure was never reliable in his world. Skepticism urged suspension of judgment, but he craved clarity, not endless doubt. The Stoics, however, spoke of endurance, of courage, of distinguishing between what lies in our power and what does not. To a boy whose very body and fate were owned, this doctrine was not abstract speculation, it was direct recognition of his condition. The Stoics told him what he already knew in his bones. You cannot command the world, but you can command yourself. The transition from listening child to active student likely came when Epaphroditus allowed him to pursue more formal training. Some accounts suggest he studied under Musonius Rufus, a prominent Stoic teacher in Rome. If true, then Epictetus's education carried him into the circle of one of the most respected minds of his age. Musonius was known for insisting that philosophy was not mere intellectual exercise, but practice, a discipline of life. This insistence must have resonated deeply with Epictetus, who had lived philosophy before he had language for it. He did not need to be convinced that philosophy was practical. His life demanded it. Think of the courage it must have taken for him to sit among students of higher social rank, free men who saw education as their right. He was still enslaved, still marked by the stigma of property. And yet, in the realm of philosophy, he was their equal. His intelligence and clarity allowed him to participate fully, and perhaps even to surpass them. Education gave him not just knowledge, but dignity. The lessons of those early studies carried into the way he would one day teach. Unlike philosophers who dazzled with rhetoric, Epictetus taught plainly, directly, without ornament. He knew what it was to be on the margins, straining to catch meaning in words not addressed to him. He vowed never to let his own students feel excluded. His clarity was a gift born of empathy. He taught the way he would have wanted to be taught as a boy at the edges of the room. It is worth pausing to consider what this says about the nature of education itself. For many, education is preparation for advancement, a way to climb the social ladder. For Epictetus, education was never about climbing. It was about anchoring. It was not a tool to gain freedom from others, but to gain freedom within himself. This reframing remains revolutionary. How many of us pursue knowledge today for status, for credentials, for control, only to find ourselves anxious and unmoored? Epictetus reminds us that true learning is measured not by degrees earned, but by mastery of one's own responses to life. His early education, then, was not just a gift of circumstance, but a crucible of transformation. It taught him not only the tenets of Stoicism, but also the discipline to live them. It gave him mentors in place of parents, philosophy in place of inheritance, and dignity in place of social recognition. More importantly, it gave him the tools to make sense of the chaos that had marked his earliest years. From childhood's uncertainty and family's fragility, he had already learned that nothing external is secure. Education added a new layer, the discovery that while nothing outside is guaranteed, something inside is unshakable. The words of the Stoics gave him language for the silent wisdom his life had already etched into him. And with that, Epictetus began to move from survival to awakening, from being shaped by fate to shaping a philosophy that would endure for millennia. Yet awakening never comes without its crises. If childhood taught him fragility, and education gave him structure, then his next stage would confront him with a deeper question. What happens when life collapses again? When philosophy must be tested not in the classroom, but in the fires of real suffering? It was in those moments of crisis that the voice of Epictetus would sharpen into the steel of conviction, a conviction that would one day steady not only himself, but anyone willing to listen. Every philosopher, no matter how enduring their voice, begins with questions that erupt not in books but in life itself. For Epictetus, those questions rose early and often, pressing against him with an urgency most of us don't encounter until midlife. If the body can be twisted until it breaks, what remains untouched? If the people you depend on can vanish, where do you root your belonging? If your very status as a human being is denied, what does it mean to claim your own dignity? These were not the polished formulations of a lecturer. They were the raw questions of a man trying to make sense of existence in conditions designed to strip him of selfhood. What distinguishes Epictetus from many thinkers is that he did not delay facing these questions until later years of comfort. They stalked him from childhood and sharpened during youth. Living as property in the Roman world meant confronting daily the gap between appearance and reality, between the stories society told and the truth of lived experience. Roman culture preached order, law, and the greatness of empire. Yet Epictetus saw disorder up close. Masters whose tempers determined life or death, officials who claimed to serve justice but used power for cruelty, wealthy elites who proclaimed philosophy while clinging to luxuries. The boy who grew into a student of Stoicism must have asked himself, how can a society obsessed with control and hierarchy fail so completely to master its own passions? These questions naturally turned inward. If the promises of family, wealth, and social order all dissolve, what remains? He would have tested these questions against the smallest details of life. When ordered to perform a task, did he have a choice in how he responded? When mocked or dismissed, could he control the meaning he gave to the insult? Even in small humiliations, he was already experimenting with the fundamental distinction that would define him: there are things in my control, and there are things beyond it. His early life, in this sense, was a constant laboratory of first philosophical questions. But there is also something deeper at work. The young Epictetus must have wondered not only how to survive, but why survival matters at all. What is the point of endurance if life itself is this fragile and unpredictable? In this, his questioning aligns with the human crisis that still visits us across centuries. In middle age, when careers feel shaky and mortality comes closer into view, many find themselves asking, why continue, when every achievement dissolves? Epictetus had already been pressed against that wall as a youth. His philosophy is not a shield from despair, but a conversation with it. He does not deny the temptation to give up. He acknowledges it, then asks how one might live courageously in full awareness of life's instability. This gives his thought an honesty often missing in more abstract systems. He did not build grand metaphysical structures about the nature of the cosmos. He did not spin theories about invisible worlds or hidden essences. His questions stayed rooted in the ground of daily life. What do you do when you lose what you love? How do you face insult without being reduced by it? How can you live with dignity in conditions that deny it? These are the questions that shaped him, and they remain as relevant now as they were then. We ask them in hospital waiting rooms, in divorce courts, and the quiet hours after careers collapse. Epictetus is not distant from us. He is standing at our side, asking what posture we will take when life shakes us awake. An important dimension of his questioning is how personal experience became philosophical testing ground. For some philosophers, questions emerge in the abstract, detached from biography. For Epictetus, biography and philosophy were fused. When his leg was injured, he confronted the question of what can and cannot be controlled. When he saw fellow slaves sold away, he asked what it means to love someone knowing they can vanish tomorrow. When he served a master whose moods could change in an instant, he questioned where real power lies. Each wife event was a philosophical problem, and each philosophical problem was also a survival problem. This seamless fusion of life and thought explains why his questions continue to reach people outside academic philosophy. His ideas do not require technical jargon. A modern worker facing layoffs asks, what part of this is in my hands, and what part isn't? A parent worrying about a child's choices asks, can I control their decisions, or only my love and guidance? Someone facing illness asks, can I control the disease, or only my response to it? These are the same questions Epictetus began to ask as a youth, stripped of illusions earlier than most. And yet, we must also notice the danger of these questions. If pressed too far, they can lead to nihilism. If nothing is stable, why try at all? If everything external is beyond our control, why invest in anything? Epictetus must have wrestled with this edge. It is the razor thin line between despair and wisdom. Many who encounter the fragility of life retreat into bitterness or apathy. What saved him from that collapse? Perhaps it was the Stoic framework that offered him not only clarity about limits, but also a path forward. Yes, much is beyond your power, but some things remain within. And in those few things, the judgments you make, the choices you take, the meanings you attach, lies the whole possibility of freedom. This shift from despair at what is uncontrollable to empowerment in what is controllable was the breakthrough that gave shape to his philosophy. It began not with polished arguments, but with first questions asked in the darkness. Is there anything I can truly claim as mine? He concluded that there was, his will, his capacity to choose his response. That was enough. From this small but indestructible foundation, he could rebuild an entire philosophy of life. Reflecting on these early questions illuminates why his later teaching had such urgency. He was not speculating about what might happen. He was remembering what already had. He knew the sting of loss, the vulnerability of attachment, the uncertainty of status. He asked what any of us would ask in such conditions. But unlike most, he stayed with the questions until they revealed their core. You cannot master life, but you can master how you live it. And here, his questions meet ours across time. We live in an age obsessed with mastery control over schedules, bodies, wealth, even emotions. But beneath the surface, we are haunted by the same uncertainty he faced. How do we live when control fails us? Epictetus's early questions rise again in modern form. They are the anxious whisper in the mind of a parent waiting for test results, the restless thought of an executive watching markets collapse, the private cry of someone realizing their marriage cannot be saved. And his answers, rooted in youth's brutal lessons, remain the same. Distinguish what is yours from what is not, and claim mastery only over yourself. The beauty of Epictetus's journey is that his first questions were not refined away, but carried into maturity. He never abandoned them for grander speculation. He remained faithful to the child who wondered where safety lies in a world that guarantees none. His philosophy is simply those first questions, lived fully and answered with courage. And as his life continued, those answers would be tested again and again, in crises that demanded not clever words, but steadfast practice. Each crisis became both threat and teacher, shaping him into the philosopher whose voice still steadies us when we are pressed against the same hard walls. Crisis is the great revealer. It strips away illusions, collapses the scaffolding we have built around ourselves, and exposes the raw frame of what we truly believe. For Epictetus, crises were not occasional interruptions in an otherwise orderly life. They were the steady rhythm of existence. From the moment of his birth, he lived in conditions where security was never promised. Yet within that turbulence, he learned something profound. It is not the crisis itself that destroys us, but the way we interpret it. A crisis is not only threat, it is a mirror, showing us whether we have anchored our lives in what is fragile or in what endures. Accounts of his life tell us that at some point his leg was twisted and broken by his master. Whether this happened as a boy or a young man, it was a turning point, a physical crisis that revealed the deeper crisis of powerlessness. Most people, facing such violence, would descend into despair or rage. But Epictetus is said to have looked up calmly and remarked, "You will break it." And when the bone snapped, he said simply, "Did I not tell you so?" This story, perhaps embellished by later writers, still conveys a truth about his posture. The breaking of his body was not the breaking of his mind. He refused to let the act of another determine the state of his soul. The crisis revealed not his fragility, but his strength. What makes this moment so significant is not the Stoic composure itself, but the philosophy beneath it. Pain was real, injustice undeniable, but he had already distinguished between what belonged to him and what did not. His master could control his leg, but not his will. The crisis became proof of his principle. External events can injure the body, but only you can consent to the ruin of your spirit. This principle would become the cornerstone of his teaching, tested not in a lecture hall, but in the heat of cruelty. We should not mistake this for indifference. Epictetus did not deny that suffering hurts. He did not pretend that betrayal, or loss, or violence are trivial. His insight was subtler. The hurt of the moment is unavoidable, but the meaning of that hurt is not fixed. Crisis asks us whether we will add a second wound to the first by interpreting events as unbearable, unfair, or catastrophic. In his own suffering, he discovered that peace is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to chain pain to despair. The loss is real. Bills must be paid, status is shaken, security is threatened. But Epictetus would ask, will you allow this external event to define your worth? Or will you recognize that while the job is gone, your capacity to act, to choose, to find dignity remains untouched? The crisis, in this view, becomes a stage on which your freedom is tested. You cannot control the play itself, but you can decide the role you will play in it. Epictetus's formative crises also confronted him with mortality. In the Roman world, disease could strike without warning, violence could erupt in streets or homes, and lives could end without ceremony. Living so close to loss sharpened his awareness that everything external is fleeting. Where others found this terrifying, he found clarity. If death is certain and loss inevitable, why tie your peace to what must pass? The crisis of mortality did not drive him to nihilism, but to urgency. Life, he concluded, is not about avoiding death, but about living with such integrity that when death comes, it finds you unafraid. This emphasis on crisis as teacher distinguished him from many philosophers of his era. While others debated the nature of the cosmos or the mechanics of knowledge, Epictetus returned again and again to the practical test. How do you behave when life collapses? A philosophy that cannot stand in crisis is no philosophy at all. This is why he dismissed much intellectual speculation as empty. For him, philosophy had to be a way of life, because only a way of life could withstand the fires of reality. His crises also revealed something about the nature of freedom. In Rome, freedom was defined legally, whether you were a citizen, whether you were manumitted, whether you had rights. Epictetus redefined freedom entirely. He insisted that true freedom is not given by law or taken by chains. True freedom is the ability to meet crisis without surrendering your inner sovereignty. In this redefinition, crisis becomes the proving ground of liberty. The man who cannot endure insult without rage is a slave to rage. The man who cannot endure loss without despair is a slave to circumstance. But the man who can face both without surrender has discovered a freedom no emperor can touch. Seen this way, Epictetus's own life was a continual rehearsal for freedom. Each crisis, violence, humiliation, uncertainty was an opportunity to practice ruling himself. He did not seek out suffering, but he did not waste it when it came. He turned every crisis into an exercise. Where most of us shrink from pain, he leaned into it as a chance to test his philosophy. This posture did not make him less human. It made him more resiliently human, able to live with dignity where others collapsed. In reflecting on his crises, we also see how they prepared him to be a teacher. His authority did not come from inherited position or academic prestige, but from lived trial. Students flocked to him not because his ideas were novel, but because his life embodied them. He could speak with warmth and force because he had survived what he taught. In their crises, exile, poverty, betrayal, his students recognized reflections of his own, and so his words carried credibility. He had walked the path before them and could point the way through. Modern readers can find in this a different model of wisdom. We often look to experts who promise solutions, systems, or quick fixes. Epictetus offers no such thing. He offers instead a posture. When crisis comes, ask what is within your power and act there. Let go of the rest. This is neither resignation nor passivity. It is courage of the most radical kind. The courage to meet life as it is, not as we wish it to be. This approach challenges us in uncomfortable ways. It asks whether our current crises, economic uncertainty, political turmoil, personal losses, are destroying us because of what they are, or because of how we interpret them. Epictetus would say it is the latter. The storm outside cannot drown you, only your surrender can. The crisis is real, but the ruin is optional. This is not easy to accept, especially in moments of real suffering. But it is precisely in those moments that his voice cuts sharpest, reminding us that freedom lies closer than we think. Epictetus's life teaches us that crises are not detours, but the main road. They are not interruptions of philosophy, but the very arena where philosophy proves itself. He learned this truth in the breaking of his body, in the loss of security, in the countless humiliations of enslavement. And yet, rather than being destroyed, he turned those experiences into a blueprint for living. His crises became his curriculum, and through him, they can become ours. As we follow the thread of his story further, we begin to see how these trials ripened into insight. His crises did not end with childhood or youth. They continued throughout his life. But each one deepened his conviction that philosophy was not an ornament, but a necessity. And each one prepared him to receive, and later to give, the wisdom that survival alone cannot provide. The wisdom that comes when crisis ceases to be enemy and becomes teacher. Awakening, in the life of Epictetus, was not the gentle dawning of ideas that drift in during quiet contemplation. It was a jolt, a confrontation, an eruption that forced him to see his life and the world around him with new clarity. Crises had shaped his early questions, but awakening meant something more. It was the moment when he realized those questions were not merely personal pains, but the very substance of philosophy itself. The hardships he endured were not unique to him. They were universal, part of the human condition. The shift from private endurance to universal recognition was the turning point, the birth of the philosopher from the silence of the slave. The awakening did not come in one dramatic moment, but unfolded gradually, like a series of shocks that together stripped away the illusions of dependence. Studying under Musonius Rufus, a prominent Stoic thinker, gave him the structure he needed. Musonius insisted that philosophy was not an intellectual game, but a discipline of life. This idea struck Epictetus with the force of recognition. He did not need to be convinced, his own life had already proven it. In the classroom, he heard articulated what his body and heart had long known. External conditions are unstable, and only the mind can be governed. What Musonius offered was not revelation so much as validation. The lessons Epictetus had lived in silence were suddenly given words, a vocabulary to explain what survival had already taught him. Yet there was something more than validation. Philosophy under Musonius also demanded courage, the courage to examine oneself without excuses. Students were expected not only to understand Stoic principles, but to practice them daily, to embody them in their choices. For Epictetus, this was not merely academic rigor. It was the path to freedom. Awakening meant seeing that philosophy could be lived as a way of being, a constant training of the mind. He began to understand that philosophy was not a refuge from suffering, but the one art that could make suffering meaningful. This realization transformed his perception of power. Rome was filled with displays of authority, emperors parading in triumph, senators issuing decrees, generals commanding armies. But Epictetus, through his awakening, saw these displays differently. He recognized that many who appeared powerful were in fact enslaved, not by masters, but by their own passions, their fears, their insatiable desires. The emperor might command nations, but if he could not command himself, he was no freer than a man in chains. This inversion of power was the heart of his awakening. True strength lay not in dominion over others, but in mastery over oneself. Awakening also changed the way he viewed suffering. Pain, loss, and humiliation no longer appeared as mere obstacles. They became training grounds, exercises in freedom. Just as athletes welcome resistance to build strength, Epictetus began to welcome hardship as an opportunity to practice resilience. This does not mean he romanticized suffering, he acknowledged its sting. but he discovered that suffering, when met with discipline, could be transformed into freedom. It was an unsettling message even then, and it remains unsettling now. We are conditioned to see suffering as meaningless interruption, to believe that peace comes only when obstacles vanish. Epictetus awakened to the opposite truth. Peace comes when you learn to stand steady in the presence of obstacles, when you stop demanding that life be gentle. There is a modern resonance here that is difficult to ignore. In contemporary culture, awakening is often packaged as enlightenment, a serene state reached through meditation, travel, or self-discovery. But Epictetus's awakening is harsher and more honest. It is not about escape or transcendence, but about confrontation. It is the recognition that life will wound you, that control is limited, and that dignity lies not in avoidance, but in response. His awakening was not mystical, it was practical. It did not remove him from life's struggles, it immersed him more deeply in them, but with new eyes. The fruits of this awakening began to show in the way he carried himself. Accounts describe Epictetus as calm, composed, direct, and unflinching. He spoke plainly, never decorating his words with unnecessary ornament. This simplicity was not lack of eloquence, but a deliberate choice. Philosophy, for him, was too urgent to be obscured. His awakening gave him clarity. People did not need dazzling arguments, they needed tools for living. He embodied those tools himself, becoming living proof that freedom was possible even under constraint. Awakening also expanded his sense of kinship. Having grown up in the fragility of enslaved family bonds, he might have been tempted to retreat into isolation. Instead, he turned outward, embracing the role of guide and teacher. His awakening had shown him that philosophy was not a private possession, but a shared path. He saw in every student the same capacity for freedom that he had discovered within himself. This is why he taught with both sternness and compassion. He demanded discipline because he knew it was the only way through suffering, but he also offered encouragement because he knew how hard the journey could be. It is worth noting how different this is from many modern ideals of awakening, which often focus on individual fulfillment. For Epictetus, awakening was inseparable from responsibility. If you had discovered freedom within, you were obligated to share it, to help others awaken as well. His philosophy was communal in practice, even if individual in foundation. He believed that each person's awakening contributed to the resilience of the whole. A society of individuals who had mastered themselves would be stronger than one built on wealth or force. The awakening of Epictetus thus stands as a challenge across the centuries. It asks whether we are willing to stop waiting for life to change and begin instead to change ourselves. It asks whether we can accept that freedom does not arrive when conditions align, but when the mind discovers its sovereignty. It asks whether we can reinterpret our crises, not as cruel accidents, but as invitations to practice strength. These questions remain urgent today, in a world still obsessed with control and still devastated by its absence. What makes Epictetus's awakening so enduring is its raw honesty. He does not promise comfort. He does not promise escape. He promises instead a different kind of peace, one that exists not because storms cease, but because you cease being tossed by them. His life itself testified to the possibility of this peace. From childhood fragility, through family instability, into crises that could have broken him, he awakened to the truth that freedom is always at hand, if only one learns to rule the inner self. In this awakening, Epictetus stepped fully into philosophy, not as abstract thought, but as lived truth. From this point forward, his life would no longer be mere endurance. It would become teaching, guiding, shaping others through the same journey. The questions of his youth had become the answers of his adulthood, and those answers would ripple outward, changing not only the lives of his immediate students, but the course of philosophy itself. And though centuries divide us from him, his awakening invites us still to see crisis as mirror, suffering as teacher, and the mind as the final frontier of freedom. No great mind emerges in isolation. Even those who claim to be self-taught are shaped by the voices, examples, and temperaments of others. For Epictetus, whose childhood and family life had denied him the usual anchors of identity, mentorship became not just guidance but replacement for what was missing. The absence of stable parents left space for philosophy to become his true parent, and those who taught him its discipline filled the role of family he had been denied. Chief among these influences was Musonius Rufus, the Roman Stoic whose own life embodied the mixture of rigor and resilience that Epictetus would later magnify in his own teachings. Musonius was no ordinary philosopher. He believed passionately that philosophy was a way of life, not a classroom exercise. He insisted that students live simply, endure hardship, and treat each moment as training for virtue. This approach, which might have felt austere or even extreme to wealthier students, must have resonated instantly with Epictetus. For him, hardship was not hypothetical. It had been the substance of life from birth. Where other students had to imagine what it meant to live without comfort, Epictetus had already done so. Musonius did not need to persuade him that philosophy must be lived rather than debated. He simply confirmed what Epictetus already knew in his bones. The mentorship of Musonius provided structure, but it also provided legitimacy. A slave, even one exposed to learning, would not automatically be taken seriously as a philosopher. The Roman world was deeply hierarchical, and intellectual circles were no exception. To be welcomed as a student of a respected teacher gave Epictetus not just knowledge, but entry into a community of thinkers. Musonius offered him something beyond technique. He offered him recognition. For someone who had grown up in the shadows of dismissal and invisibility, this recognition was transformative. It was the first sign that his mind, though owned by none, had value that others could see. We should pause to consider the role of mentors more broadly. For many, especially those who have grown up without steady parental figures, the influence of a teacher, coach, or guide can alter the trajectory of life. Epictetus's story speaks to this universal pattern. When family fails or falters, mentorship steps in as the architecture of growth. The mentor does not erase the pain of absence, but provides an alternative lineage, a way of belonging that is not biological, but philosophical. Musonius was, in this sense, a philosophical father to Epictetus, modeling not only ideas, but also a way of inhabiting them. The dynamic between the two men was marked by both similarity and difference. Musonius, though he endured exile for his convictions, had lived as a free man. His teaching of simplicity was chosen. Epictetus, by contrast, had been born into deprivation. What Musonius embraced voluntarily, Epictetus endured involuntarily. This difference mattered. It gave Epictetus an authority his teacher could not match. Musonius could encourage his students to live with fewer possessions. Epictetus had already lived with nothing. Musonius could recommend fortitude in the face of difficulty. Epictetus had survived chains and violence. The mentorship worked in both directions. Musonius gave him philosophical language, but Epictetus gave those ideas a credibility that came only through lived extremity. Other influences also shaped him. Living in Rome during the reign of Nero exposed Epictetus to the spectacle of unchecked power. He saw how emperors, surrounded by luxury and authority, remained enslaved to their own fears, appetites, and vanities. Observing this must have deepened the lesson that Musonius taught: appearances deceive. The man who seems powerful may in fact be weak, and the one who seems powerless may in fact be free. Rome itself became a mentor to Epictetus, not through its philosophers, but through its contradictions, its excesses, its parade of human folly. Every street, every household, every act of cruelty was a lecture on the unreliability of fortune and the necessity of inner mastery. The combination of a formal teacher and the informal instruction of life gave Epictetus a kind of double education. From Musonius, he learned the disciplined language of Stoicism. From Rome, he learned the raw evidence that Stoicism was true. Together, they formed the crucible in which his philosophy matured. He did not retreat into abstract speculation, because both his mentor and his world insisted on practicality. The question was never, what is truth in theory, but always, how will you live when crisis comes? This insistence kept his philosophy sharp, urgent, and free of ornament. Mentorship also shaped his own eventual style of teaching. Epictetus did not write books, he taught orally. His words recorded later by his student Arian. He taught in a manner reminiscent of his own education, direct, uncompromising, personal. He challenged his students not to admire philosophy, but to embody it. He scolded them when they treated philosophy as entertainment. He told them bluntly to change their lives. This sternness echoes Musonius's influence, but Epictetus made it his own, infused with the authority of someone who had no illusions about life's harshness. His students were not pampered elites to him, they were fellow travelers who needed the same clarity he had once needed. In reflecting on the importance of mentorship, it becomes clear that Epictetus represents a wider truth. Wisdom is rarely self-generated. It arises in conversation, in imitation, in response to examples both good and bad. Epictetus was mentored not only by Musonius, but by his suffering, by the cruelty of masters, by the instability of family, by the contradictions of Rome. All of these voices taught him something, and he had the humility to learn. His greatness lies not only in his originality, but in his openness to formation. He allowed life and others to shape him, and then he reshaped what he learned into a philosophy of liberation. There is also a modern echo here. In a culture that prizes autonomy, we often forget the necessity of mentors. We imagine ourselves as self-made. Epictetus reminds us that even the most resilient independence is forged in dialogue with others. Without Musonius, his philosophy might never have found its form. Without Rome's chaos, his philosophy might never have found its urgency. Without these influences, the voice that still reaches us might never have been heard. To recognize the importance of mentorship is not to diminish Epictetus's originality, but to honor the web of human influence that makes any voice possible. And so, the story of his intellectual formation is also a story of gratitude. Though he began with little, Epictetus did not walk alone. He was shaped by a teacher who gave him discipline, by a society that provided endless lessons in folly, by experiences of pain that clarified what matters. Each influence became part of him, and in turn, he became a mentor for others. The lineage of philosophy continued through him, not by inheritance of blood, but by inheritance of wisdom. And in this sense, every student who reads his words today joins that lineage, mentored by a man who knew how to turn hardship into teaching. Through the guidance of Musonius and the lessons of Rome, Epictetus grew into the philosopher whose voice would challenge emperors and comfort the broken. Mentorship had given him a foundation, but it was his own resilience that transformed those lessons into living truth. And as his life moved forward, he would begin to craft insights that were not merely borrowed from others, but born from his own conviction. Insights that would endure long after the empire that enslaved him crumbled into dust. The first stirrings of genuine insight in Epictetus's life did not emerge from comfort or luxury, but from the convergence of lived hardship and philosophical discipline. He had endured the fractures of childhood instability, absorbed the lessons of fragility through the absence of family, and sharpened his questions in the crucible of repeated crises. Under the influence of Musonius Rufus and the Stoic tradition, these threads began to weave into something new, the recognition that freedom, dignity, and peace are possible only when you locate them within yourself. This recognition, not as a vague intuition, but as a firm conviction, was his first major insight, the moment when philosophy ceased being an external teaching and became the pulse of his own thought. The story of his broken leg offers more than a tale of composure. It reveals a principle he would later crystallize. When his master twisted his limb until the bone snapped, Epictetus accepted what was beyond his control, while refusing to surrender his attitude. He chose calm where another might have chosen despair. This was not indifference to pain, but a radical reframing. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. His insight was that the true wound occurs not in the body, but in the mind, when we grant events the power to define us. From this moment on, he understood that the will, our power of assent or refusal, is the one domain over which no tyrant, no master, no circumstance can reign. It means that freedom is not about external conditions, but about sovereignty of mind. It means that even the most powerless person can discover dignity, and that even the most powerful ruler may be enslaved by fear, greed, or anger. This inversion of values was revolutionary. Rome's hierarchy rested on external markers: birth, wealth, rank. Epictetus's first major insight declared all of these irrelevant. The true measure of a person lay not in their possessions or position, but in their command of themselves. What made this insight transformative was that it was lived, not merely theorized. Epictetus did not stumble on it during leisure or reflection, but under conditions designed to humiliate and control him. That is why his philosophy would later speak so directly to soldiers, slaves, rulers, and ordinary people alike. His insight was tested at the very edge of human endurance. When he later taught that no man is free who is not master of himself, he was not issuing an abstract axiom, he was recounting a truth carved into him by violence. There is a deep relevance here for modern life. In our world, we often tie identity and peace to circumstances: financial stability, social approval, health, relationships. When these collapse, we feel ruined. Epictetus's first major insight cuts against this habit. He asks, what part of your life truly belongs to you? Can you control the stock market, the opinions of others, the fragility of health, the passage of time? No. But can you control how you interpret, how you respond, how you orient yourself? Yes. His insight was not an escape from responsibility, but a sharpening of it. Focus all your energy on the one arena that is truly yours, and you will discover unshakable freedom even in a world you cannot command. What makes this insight even more remarkable is the humility that accompanied it. Epictetus did not present himself as a genius who discovered new truths. He acknowledged that the Stoic tradition had long articulated the distinction between what lies within our power and what does not. His originality lay not in invention, but in embodiment. Many before him had repeated the Stoic maxim, but few had lived it as intensely. His insight was not the creation of a new doctrine, but the awakening to its absolute reality in his own life. In this sense, Epictetus demonstrates that philosophy's power is not in novelty, but in authenticity. The same truths can be repeated for centuries, but they strike with fresh force when someone lives them fully. This insight also altered his relationship with suffering. He came to see adversity not as interruption, but as training. Every insult, every setback, every loss became an opportunity to practice mastery of self. This reframing turned the chaos of life into a kind of curriculum. Just as an athlete grows stronger by resisting weight, so the philosopher grows freer by resisting despair. His first insight was that adversity is unavoidable. His deeper realization was that adversity is indispensable. It is the training ground of freedom. Without trials, freedom remains theoretical. With trials, freedom becomes embodied. One can imagine the young Epictetus, limping through the streets of Rome, watching senators strut and masters command, while inwardly measuring them against his own standard. Were they truly free, these men who trembled at public opinion, who schemed endlessly for power, who panicked at the thought of exile or disgrace? He must have seen them as pitiable, enslaved not to chains, but to desire and fear. And he must have recognized that his own condition, though outwardly degraded, placed him closer to freedom than those gilded captives of ambition. This inversion was not arrogance, but clarity. True worth lies in what cannot be taken. Modern readers often encounter this insight as a kind of therapeutic advice. Focus on what you can control, let go of what you can't. But in Epictetus's mouth, it was not therapy, it was revolution. It undermined the entire value system of his society, declaring emperors enslaved and slaves potentially free. It stripped power of its glamour and revealed its hollowness. His first insight, born in pain, redefined what it means to live well. To see how radical this was, imagine if you truly lived it. Imagine if every insult rolled off you, not because you were numb, but because you refused to grant another power over your mind. Imagine if every financial loss hurt but did not shake your sense of worth. Imagine if illness, though difficult, could not rob you of dignity. That is the life Epictetus glimpsed in his first insight. It was not a life without hardship. It was a life immune to ruin. What distinguishes Epictetus's realization from mere Stoic toughness is its warmth. He did not harden into indifference, shutting out love or connection. He taught his students to cherish relationships deeply, but always with the awareness that they are fragile. Love, in his philosophy, was not diminished by recognizing its impermanence. It was deepened. To love someone knowing you cannot control their fate is to love them honestly, without illusion. His first insight, then, was not withdrawal from life, but fuller participation in it, grounded in truth rather than fantasy. In this way, Epictetus's early insight created the foundation for everything that would follow. It gave him the lens through which to interpret his past, the compass to navigate his present, and the conviction to teach others in the future. It was the turning point where suffering ceased to be mere endurance and became the doorway to wisdom. And from that doorway, he would begin to walk the path not only of a survivor, but of a philosopher whose words could steady the trembling hearts of generations to come. This first insight was not the end of his awakening, but its beginning. With it, he had discovered the principle that would guide his life, that true freedom lies within. From this conviction would flow his teachings, his style, and his enduring legacy. Yet conviction alone is not enough. Insight must be tested, refined, and embodied in daily living. And as Epictetus moved forward, his early writings and conversations would become the arena in which he began to shape, articulate, and share this truth with others, ensuring that his hard-won freedom would not end with himself, but become a gift to the world. When a human being first begins to give voice to their thoughts, the difference between endurance and philosophy becomes clear. Endurance is silent, it bears hardship with clenched teeth. Philosophy speaks, it shapes hardship into meaning, offering lessons that others can carry. For Epictetus, the moment of transition from silent endurance to spoken philosophy arrived when he began to formulate his insights for others. His first writings were not polished treatises intended for fame, but fragments of thought, lessons distilled from survival and sharpened by education. In the presence of students and fellow seekers, he began to articulate, for the first time, the philosophy that had been fermenting within him since childhood. Epictetus himself left no writings. This fact is crucial. What survives comes from his student Arrian, who recorded his teacher's discourses with the fidelity of someone who knew he was witnessing wisdom worth preserving. The absence of authored texts has often puzzled historians. Did Epictetus choose not to write, or did circumstance prevent him from doing so? The answer may lie in his philosophy itself. He insisted repeatedly that philosophy is not in books but in lives. To write would have been, in his eyes, a secondary task, always at risk of turning philosophy into ornament rather than practice. His classroom was his page, his spoken word, his ink, his students, the parchment upon which his ideas were inscribed. Yet the earliest recorded discourses reveal the freshness of a man discovering his own voice. They are not grand theoretical systems, but conversations filled with urgency. He presses students to examine themselves, to stop treating philosophy as entertainment, and to confront their own lives with honesty. He scolds those who attend lectures as if visiting a theater, hungry for stimulation but unwilling to change. His words cut to the bone. If you leave my classroom unchanged, you have wasted your time. The rawness of these first teachings reflects his impatience with pretense. Having lived through chains and suffering, he had no tolerance for philosophy as performance. The originality of these early teachings lies not in novelty, but in intensity. Stoicism had been taught for centuries, but in Epictetus's mouth, the doctrine felt urgent, lived, uncompromising. He spoke of control and non-control, not as abstract categories, but as distinctions tested in flesh and blood. Students hearing him for the first time must have sensed the difference. Here was not a man reciting doctrines, but a man whose body and story bore the marks of philosophy. His limp, his past as a slave, his composure and hardship, all of it testified to the truth of his words. The first writings, then, were less about the discovery of new ideas than about the discovery of a new authority, the authority of lived authenticity. This raises an important point about the nature of philosophical beginnings. Many thinkers seek originality, desperate to carve a new path distinct from their predecessors. Epictetus sought embodiment. His originality came not from inventing ideas, but from embodying them so fully that they became undeniable. His early discourses reveal a man less concerned with system building than with the transformation of souls. He cared little for abstract speculation and much for the practical art of living. If an idea did not change the way one endured insult, loss, or illness, it was useless. This emphasis gave his first teachings a raw, almost confrontational quality. They did not flatter, they demanded. The early discourses also show a surprising tenderness. Beneath his sternness lay compassion for human weakness. He knew that change was difficult, that fear and desire pulled strongly at even the most disciplined minds. He did not shame his students for struggling, he invited them to practice. Each crisis, each temptation, each insult was an exercise. He urged them to see themselves as athletes of the mind, training daily to strengthen their freedom. This metaphor, so frequent in his teaching, likely emerged in these first writings. Life was a gymnasium, hardship, the weights, philosophy, the training program. This framing gave dignity to suffering, transforming it into a path toward mastery. To modern ears, these teachings still feel alive. His earliest recorded words echo in situations as ordinary as workplace frustrations or family tensions. When he reminds us not to tie our peace to what others think, we recognize the trap of social media validation. When he warns against chasing wealth or power, we recognize the endless treadmill of career ambition. His insistence that philosophy must change how we live resonates with anyone who has grown weary of self-help advice that inspires briefly but evaporates under stress. The early voice of Epictetus is timeless because it addresses not abstract problems but human dilemmas that repeat across centuries. It is worth considering, too, what it meant for a man of his status to speak so boldly. Rome was a world of rigid hierarchies. Slaves were expected to serve quietly, not to lecture free men about freedom. For Epictetus to teach at all was a reversal of social order. His authority did not come from birth or wealth, but from truth. That he dared to articulate philosophy as one once enslaved was itself a philosophical act. His voice announced that dignity belongs not to status, but to virtue. His earliest teachings, therefore, carried not only content but defiance. The defiance of a man who had found freedom where society said it was impossible. His refusal to write his own works may also have been a statement of trust. By entrusting his words to students, he lived the principle that what is outside our control should not preoccupy us. Whether his words survived in text was not his to guarantee. What mattered was that they survived in lives. Arrian, recognizing their power, took it upon himself to preserve them. The fact that we read Epictetus today through the eyes of a devoted student underscores the relational nature of his philosophy. It was never solitary. It was always dialogical, a shared journey. His first writings, then, were not writings at all, but dialogues inscribed in memory, testimony to the transformative power of spoken truth. The significance of these early teachings cannot be overstated. They marked the moment when Epictetus began to turn personal survival into public philosophy. What had been private insight became shared wisdom. What had been endurance became instruction. In this transition lies the essence of philosophy itself, to take the raw material of experience and shape it into something communicable, something that can guide others. Epictetus's first writings embody this shift, not in polished treatises, but in urgent, living words. They also reveal the paradox at the heart of his legacy. He wrote nothing, yet his philosophy survives. He owned nothing, yet his words became a treasure for generations. He sought no fame, yet his name endures while emperors who once ruled his world are forgotten by most. His early teachings planted the seeds of this paradox, showing that influence does not depend on possessions or status, but on the authenticity of truth lived and spoken. In considering these beginnings, we see the pattern of his life crystallizing. Each stage, childhood fragility, family absence, formative crises, awakening under Musonius, had prepared him to speak. Now, with his first teachings echoing through Rome, his voice entered the public sphere. What began as survival had become philosophy. What began as silence had become discourse. And from these first steps, the trajectory was set. Epictetus would grow not only as a thinker, but as a teacher, whose words could transform not just individuals, but entire cultures of thought. When we turn to the question of Epictetus's personal relationships, we step into a quieter and less documented dimension of his life, but one that is no less revealing of his philosophy. He was not a figure who left behind love letters, dramatic accounts of romance, or tales of political alliances sealed by marriage. Instead, what we know comes in fragments, anecdotes, offhand remarks, the testimony of his students. And yet, these fragments point to a man who regarded relationships not as adornments or entanglements, but as arenas where philosophy was tested most severely. To live well with others, to love without clinging, to remain steady when bonds broke. This was for him the highest and most difficult discipline. The ancient sources suggest that Epictetus lived simply, without seeking a household filled with dependence or wealth. For much of his life, he appears to have remained unmarried, committed instead to teaching and the cultivation of his inner discipline. Yet later in life, he took in a child. Some accounts say he adopted an abandoned infant and raised it with the help of a woman who lived with him. This small detail, easily overlooked, speaks volumes. A man who had once been deprived of family stability chose to become a caretaker, not out of obligation, but out of compassion. He did not teach philosophy as withdrawal from human ties. He demonstrated through action that love and responsibility were part of a wise life, so long as they were embraced without illusion. Here we see the paradox at the heart of his philosophy of relationships. On one hand, Epictetus warned constantly against attachment to things or people as though they were permanent. He urged his students to remember that loved ones are mortal, that children may die, that friends may betray, that separation is inevitable. To modern ears, this can sound cold, even cruel. But in practice, his stance produced a deeper kind of tenderness. By accepting the fragility of relationships, he could cherish them more fully in the moment. He did not cling to permanence, he celebrated presence. The act of raising a child, knowing that loss is inevitable, becomes in this light an act of courage as well as love. A true friend, for Epictetus, was one who encouraged you to grow, who challenged you when you strayed, who reminded you of your principles when temptation arose. Friendship was not a refuge from philosophy, but a form of it. To choose a friend was to choose a fellow traveler in the pursuit of freedom. This conception of friendship made his relationships selective but profound. He did not surround himself with admirers or sycophants. He drew near to those who sought the same clarity he did, and from that closeness grew bonds of respect stronger than mere convenience. The classroom itself was one of his primary relationships. His students were not simply listeners, they were companions in a shared struggle. Accounts describe the intimacy of his teaching, the stern rebukes delivered like those of a father, the encouragement given like that of a mentor, the challenges posed as if to peers. He did not position himself as an aloof sage dispensing wisdom from a distance. He engaged personally, sometimes even sharply, because he cared about their transformation. His relationship with Arian, the student who preserved his discourses, is perhaps the most enduring example. Arian did not merely copy his words, he absorbed his way of life, and in doing so ensured that Epictetus's philosophy would outlive him. This transmission itself is a testament to relationship. Philosophy did not survive through written systems, but through the devotion of a student to a teacher he respected profoundly. In reflecting on these dynamics, it becomes clear that Epictetus's relationships were marked by a balance of detachment and intimacy. He did not avoid bonds, but he insisted on meeting them without illusion. This balance resonates deeply with modern struggles. Many people today are caught between two extremes, clinging desperately to relationships, expecting them to provide permanent security, or withdrawing from them entirely in fear of loss. Epictetus offers another path. Engage fully, love deeply, but never pretend that impermanence is not part of the deal. By accepting mortality and change as facts, he freed himself to relate with honesty rather than fear. Consider how this applies to family life today. Parents often build their identity on their children's success, tying their peace to outcomes they cannot ultimately control. Lovers often bind their worth to the permanence of a relationship, devastated when it falters. Friends sometimes demand constancy that human life cannot deliver. Epictetus would say, You are loving the illusion, not the reality. Love what is truly there. The living child, the present partner, the current friend, without pretending they are yours forever. Such an approach does not diminish love, it liberates it from fear. When you stop clinging to permanence, you can finally savor the fleeting gift of connection as it is. His personal life, sparse though the records may be, demonstrates this principle. To raise an abandoned child is to affirm life even in the face of its fragility. To remain mostly free of entangling attachments is not rejection, but discipline, ensuring that his inner freedom remained intact. To cultivate deep bonds with students is to show that friendship can be both tender and rigorous. His relationships were not numerous, but they were deliberate, shaped by the same philosophy he taught. What also stands out is the consistency between his public voice and private life. Many philosophers are betrayed by the gap between their theories and their conduct. Epictetus's relationships show no such divide. He did not preach detachment while clinging to family privilege, nor did he teach simplicity while living in luxury. His few known personal bonds embody the very principles he proclaimed. He raised a child without illusion, befriended students without manipulation, engaged companions without possessiveness. This integrity gave his philosophy a credibility that no rhetorical flourish could match. Looking deeper, one might say that Epictetus's relationship with philosophy itself was his truest bond. For him, philosophy was not merely a discipline, it was a companion, a lifelong partner. Where others found stability in family lineage or political alliances, he found it in the relentless dialogue with reason, with virtue, with the pursuit of inner freedom. This relationship sustained him through solitude, through exile, through the uncertainties of a life with little external security. Philosophy was the parent who instructed him, the friend who never abandoned him, the partner who traveled with him until death. The importance of this becomes clearer when compared with our own age. We often expect relationships to bear the entire weight of our search for meaning. We demand that family or lovers anchor us against chaos. When they falter, as they inevitably do, we feel betrayed. Epictetus's example suggests another foundation. Cultivate a relationship with wisdom itself, so that when external bonds weaken, you are not emptied. This does not negate human love, it enhances it. It ensures that love is offered freely rather than demanded as necessity. Thus, even though the record of Epictetus's personal relationships is fragmentary, it is profoundly instructive. His life shows that philosophy is not a retreat from human connection, but its refinement. By accepting impermanence, he could love without fear. By grounding himself in philosophy, he could give to others without neediness. By living simply, he could act compassionately without clinging. His relationships, far from contradicting his Stoic principles, illuminated them in action. In the end, Epictetus's legacy is not only the words recorded by Arrian, but the living example of how a man who began life as property could form relationships that transcended possession. He demonstrated that bonds are strongest not when they are clutched, but when they are honored with clarity. In this lies the enduring lesson that to live wisely with others, one must first learn to live freely within oneself, and that only by mastering the relationship to one's own mind can one embrace the fragility and beauty of all other bonds. The measure of a philosophy is not only in the ideas it proclaims, but in the way it shapes a person's dealings with others. While his discourses rarely dwell on his private life, the fragments we do possess, coupled with the consistent tone of his teachings, reveal a man whose bonds with others were carefully chosen, deeply humane, and rigorously shaped by his conviction that no relationship, however precious, should enslave the mind. The relationship for which we have the clearest evidence is his role as a teacher. His students were not incidental to his life, but central to it. The classroom was his family, the dialogue his intimacy, and the shared pursuit of virtue, his form of companionship. Arrian, the devoted student who transcribed his discourses, describes Epictetus with the warmth of a disciple who found not only instruction but guidance for life itself. This bond was more than academic. Epictetus became for his students a moral compass, a figure who demanded discipline yet offered clarity, who cut through excuses with the precision of a surgeon, but did so out of a conviction that transformation was possible. The relationship was paternal in its sternness, fraternal in its solidarity, and spiritual in its depth. The dynamics between Epictetus and his students illuminate much about his philosophy of love and connection. He urged them to be vigilant about the attachments that bind the soul, and yet he himself was profoundly committed to their growth. His rebukes were sharp, but his investment was real. He scolded them for treating philosophy as performance, because he cared enough to want them to live it. This is not indifference, it is intimacy of the highest kind. He related to them not as customers or admirers, but as fellow human beings who needed to be awakened to their own capacity for freedom. His relationships with students thus embodied the paradox of Stoic love: to care deeply without clinging, to engage fiercely without becoming enslaved by the need for approval. Outside the classroom, Epictetus's most striking personal relationship is recorded late in his life, when he reportedly took in an abandoned infant and, with the help of a woman in his household, raised the child. This single act, simple on its face, radiates with philosophical significance. A man who had known abandonment in his own childhood chose to prevent it in another. A philosopher who had taught that family bonds are fragile nonetheless embraced responsibility for a vulnerable life. And a teacher who had emphasized detachment from outcomes nevertheless entered into the most uncertain of commitments: parenthood. Far from contradicting his philosophy, this action reveals its depth. To act with compassion while knowing you cannot control the future is the essence of Stoic love. He loved not by denying impermanence, but by accepting it and choosing to act anyway. This act also illustrates an often overlooked aspect of Stoicism: its insistence that philosophy is not retreat, but engagement. Epictetus did not live in monastic withdrawal. His choice to raise a child shows that detachment does not mean indifference, and that recognizing impermanence does not absolve one of responsibility. Instead, he demonstrated a way of relating that was neither clinging nor neglectful, a way of loving fully in the present while remaining free of the demand that life guarantee permanence. For modern readers, this is perhaps one of his most radical lessons: that you can care fiercely and still remain inwardly free. His philosophy of relationships extended into the realm of friendship. He defined true friendship, not as shared amusement or convenience, but as mutual commitment to virtue. A friend, in his eyes, was not someone who indulged your weaknesses, but someone who held you accountable to your principles. This redefinition elevated friendship from a matter of taste to a matter of ethics. For Epictetus, to be a friend was to walk alongside another in the pursuit of wisdom, to encourage them toward self-mastery, and to challenge them when they fell into error. His relationships thus carried both tenderness and rigor, a blend that few achieve but that made him profoundly trustworthy to those who sought real growth. It is striking that despite his emphasis on detachment, the reports of Epictetus's interactions with others do not depict a cold or aloof figure. Students describe him as approachable, even warm in his severity. His bluntness was not cruelty, but a form of honesty, a refusal to flatter or deceive. In this, he practiced a rare kind of intimacy, the intimacy of truth. To relate to others without manipulation, without need for approval, without fear of displeasing, is perhaps the purest form of relationship. It is love stripped of self-interest. His students trusted him not because he comforted them, but because he respected them enough to tell them the truth. The contrast between Epictetus's relationships and the relationships modeled by Roman society is also worth noting. Roman elites often treated relationships as transactions: marriages arranged for political advantage, friendships maintained for mutual gain, alliances formed to climb the ladder of power. Against this backdrop, Epictetus's way of relating was revolutionary. He had no status to trade, no wealth to offer, no ambition to advance. His connections were built not on use but on virtue. This gave his relationships a purity rare in any age. They were not contaminated by ambition or fear, because he had already renounced both. In modern life, the challenge of relationships is often the same as it was in Rome: the temptation to turn others into extensions of ourselves. We cling to family as if they guarantee identity, to partners as if they can secure our happiness, to friends as if they exist to shield us from loneliness. Epictetus's life and teachings confront us with an uncomfortable but liberating question. Can you love someone without needing to own them, without demanding permanence, without tying your peace to their choices? His own relationships suggest that the answer is yes, though it requires discipline, humility, and courage. The consistency between his teaching and his relationships also enhances his credibility. Unlike many philosophers who wrote eloquently about ideals they could not live, Epictetus practiced what he preached. He embraced a child while knowing its fragility, befriended students while refusing to flatter, and loved humanity without demanding that it be other than it was. His relationships were lived philosophy, proof that his principles were not abstractions but workable truths. Perhaps the deepest relationship in his life, however, was not with a person but with philosophy itself. For Epictetus, philosophy was not a tool or a pastime, but a companion. It gave him the guidance his parents could not, the stability Rome refused, and the dignity slavery tried to erase. In this sense, philosophy was the most faithful partner of his life, shaping every bond he formed with others. His relationship with philosophy became the model for his relationship with people: steady, honest, engaged, but free of illusion. By looking at the fragmentary but telling evidence of his personal relationships, we see how his philosophy was not merely proclaimed but embodied. He showed that detachment and compassion are not opposites, that one can accept impermanence and still embrace responsibility, that love is richest when freed from possession. His relationships remind us that the Stoic path is not isolation but transformation, a way of engaging with others that honors both their fragility and their dignity. And in this, Epictetus offers a vision of human connection that remains both challenging and profoundly relevant: to care without clinging, to love without fear, and to walk alongside others in the shared pursuit of freedom. The journey of Epictetus's thought to this point had been marked by survival, awakening, and the first articulation of insight. But philosophy does not remain static at the level of fragments or occasional remarks. To become enduring, it must develop into a coherent vision, a framework not only for the thinker, but for those who seek guidance. The formation of Epictetus's core philosophy was the gradual sharpening of themes already present in his life: control and non-control, freedom and enslavement, love and detachment, into a disciplined body of teaching that could be transmitted to others. His personal endurance and early insights now crystallized into a way of life he demanded of himself and of anyone willing to listen. The foundation of his philosophy rested on a distinction so simple it seems almost childlike: there are things within our control and things beyond it. Yet in that division, he uncovered an entire vision of life. For Epictetus, within our control are our judgments, our choices, our intentions, and the meanings we assign to events. Beyond our control lie the body, wealth, reputation, the opinions of others, and even life itself. The tragedy of most human beings, he argued, is that they confuse these categories, investing all their energy in what they cannot command, while neglecting the mastery of what they can. From this error spring anxiety, despair, and the sense of perpetual bondage. What gave this principle its force was the way Epictetus lived it. He had known from his earliest years that the external world cannot be controlled. Born into slavery, subjected to violence, deprived of family, he had every reason to despair. Yet, out of that very condition, he drew the conviction that inner freedom is possible for anyone. His philosophy was not a denial of external suffering, but a radical reorientation. If you root your peace in externals, you are doomed. If you root it in the governance of your mind, you are free. The core of his philosophy was thus not escape from the world, but mastery of self in the midst of it. Developing this vision required a continual refining of how to respond to the common struggles of human life. Take anger, for instance. Epictetus recognized how easily people enslave themselves to rage when insulted or obstructed. To him, the insult itself was not the injury. The true injury was consenting to let another determine your state of mind. In teaching his students to pause, to remember that judgment lies within, he reframed anger as a failure of philosophy rather than an inevitable reflex. The same applied to grief. He did not deny its sting, but he insisted that mourning should never turn into collapse. To grieve without destroying oneself was, in his eyes, the mark of wisdom. In this way, his philosophy moved from broad principle into the details of daily living, where it could be tested and practiced. The metaphor of life as training became increasingly central to his teaching. Just as an athlete accepts resistance as necessary for strength, so the philosopher must accept hardship as necessary for freedom. Each setback was to be met as an exercise, a chance to strengthen the will. This reframing was transformative. Suffering ceased to be meaningless and became purposeful. Misfortune was no longer merely endured, but used. His philosophy thereby turned the entire landscape of life, pain, insult, failure, even death, into a gymnasium for the soul. To live as a Stoic was to train daily in the art of freedom, never wasting a moment of difficulty, never shrinking from the weight that could make you stronger. In developing his core philosophy, Epictetus also emphasized the role of desire and aversion. To desire what lies outside your control is to guarantee disappointment. To fear what cannot be avoided is to guarantee misery. The wise person, he taught, desires only what can truly be theirs, the cultivation of virtue, the exercise of choice, and fears only the corruption of their own character. Everything else is neutral, neither good nor bad in itself, but made so by our interpretation. Wealth is not evil, but clinging to it is enslavement. Poverty is not misery, but resenting it is. Illness is not degradation, but fearing it makes one degraded. His philosophy thus turned upside down the ordinary scales of value, teaching that nothing external could bless or curse you unless you surrendered the power of judgment. As his ideas matured, he also began to challenge cultural assumptions more directly. In Rome, honor and shame were public currencies, determining social worth. Epictetus dismissed both as irrelevant to freedom. What matters is not whether others praise or scorn you, but whether you remain faithful to your own principles. Similarly, while Rome glorified political power, he redefined true power as self-mastery. The emperor himself, if ruled by passions, was in chains. The slave, if master of himself, was free. These reversals shocked his contemporaries, yet they carried undeniable weight because they were lived truths. What gave Epictetus's philosophy its distinctive voice was his refusal to separate teaching from practice. He mocked those who could recite doctrines fluently, but collapsed in the face of minor inconvenience. To memorize principles without embodying them was worse than useless. It was hypocrisy. For him, philosophy was not measured by eloquence, but by resilience. Could you remain steady when insulted? Could you refrain from despair when fortunes turned? Could you meet death with dignity? If not, then no number of scrolls or lectures could make you a philosopher. His philosophy demanded embodiment, not admiration. The development of his thought also included a vision of human community. He taught that while we must remain free of clinging attachments, we are nonetheless bound to one another as parts of a larger whole. Each person, he said, is an actor in a play written by divine order. You cannot choose your role, but you can choose how to perform it. Whether slave or emperor, parent or child, you are bound to play your part with integrity. This teaching offered a balance between individual freedom and social duty. One could detach from illusions of control while still fulfilling responsibilities to others, not out of fear or compulsion, but out of respect for the larger order of which we are a part. By the time his philosophy had crystallized, Epictetus had created a system that was at once rigorous and humane, austere and compassionate. He did not deny suffering, but he stripped it of its power to enslave. He did not promise comfort, but he promised dignity. He did not eliminate grief, but he placed it in perspective. His core philosophy was thus both a shield and a challenge, a shield against the chaos of fortune, and a challenge to live with a discipline most people would rather avoid. It does not require elaborate metaphysics or specialized knowledge. It asks only that you examine your life honestly and discipline your mind to distinguish what belongs to you from what does not. Its simplicity makes it accessible, but its practice makes it demanding. That balance, simplicity in principle, difficulty in practice ensures that it remains perennially relevant. People return to Epictetus not because he offers easy comfort, but because he offers the hard truth that makes freedom possible. Thus, the development of his core philosophy was not a matter of abstract construction, but of lived refinement. Each crisis, each teaching moment, each reflection added depth to the central vision: freedom lies within, and only the disciplined mind can claim it. From here, his life would carry these ideas outward into the public sphere, where his first major works and the reception they stirred would test how far his philosophy could reach beyond the classroom. The quiet labor of refining one's philosophy is one thing. The moment of stepping into public life, where those ideas must breathe among others, is another. For Epictetus, this shift came after years of preparation, and it marked the transformation of his philosophy from private conviction into a public force. Until then, his ideas had lived within him, tested by hardship and sharpened in conversation with students. Now, they began to shape communities, influence broader circles, and announce themselves as a distinct voice within the intellectual life of Rome and beyond. The emergence of Epictetus as a public figure is significant because it shows us how philosophy becomes more than a set of personal maxims. It becomes a social presence, something that can challenge cultures and guide generations. This emergence did not happen through books or political speeches, but through teaching. Unlike philosophers who sought fame by writing grand treatises, Epictetus spoke directly, and his classroom became the stage on which his philosophy entered the world. His voice was his medium, and his students were his first audience. Word spread quickly about the man who had been enslaved, who bore the limp of a crippled body, yet spoke with a clarity that humbled senators and inspired commoners. In an age when reputation and social status often determined credibility, Epictetus's authority came from something entirely different: the authenticity of a life lived in accordance with its principles. People came not to be entertained, but because they sensed they would leave changed. One of the remarkable features of his emergence is how it inverted Roman cultural values. Roman society placed enormous emphasis on wealth, lineage, and public power. Yet here was a man with none of these, teaching that true power lay in self-mastery, that wealth was irrelevant, and that lineage meant nothing compared to character. His very presence in the intellectual life of the time was a rebuke to its assumptions. By standing before free men and instructing them in the art of freedom, Epictetus made visible the paradox that the enslaved man could be freer than his masters. His classroom became a theater of reversal, where the powerless taught the powerful what freedom really meant. This emergence was not without risk. Philosophers under Rome often walked a delicate line. Too much boldness, and they could provoke suspicion from rulers who feared dissent. Too much accommodation, and they risked betraying their integrity. Epictetus, in keeping with his philosophy, did not soften his words to appease authority. He spoke bluntly about the limits of external power and the folly of those who sought to control what cannot be controlled. In doing so, he offered a quiet but unmistakable critique of the imperial system itself. His insistence that no one can truly enslave the mind was both a consolation to the oppressed and a warning to the oppressors. The exile of philosophers under Domitian in 93 CE, which drove many thinkers out of Rome, became a pivotal moment in his public life. Epictetus relocated to Nicopolis in Greece, where he established his own school. What might have seemed a setback became an opportunity. Removed from the intrigues of Rome, he created a space dedicated entirely to philosophy as a way of life. His school attracted students from across the empire, men who would carry his teachings back to their cities, spreading his influence far beyond the walls of Nicopolis. This exile, rather than silencing him, amplified his voice. It gave him the freedom to teach without fear of imperial scrutiny and allowed his philosophy to root itself in a community of practice rather than the distractions of Roman politics. In Nicopolis, Epictetus's public presence reached maturity. His discourses were not lectures in the academic sense, but dialogues filled with urgency. He challenged students to see their own hypocrisies, to recognize how often they claimed to admire Stoicism while living in contradiction to it. He mocked those who could repeat Stoic slogans but panicked when illness struck or insult arrived. His school was not a place for abstract debate, but a training ground for living. The very form of his teaching was public emergence. It announced that philosophy was not an elite pursuit, but a discipline available to anyone willing to practice it. What is striking is how his emergence shaped not only individuals, but cultures of thought. Soldiers carried his maxims into war, merchants into their dealings, magistrates into their offices. His words began to seep into the bloodstream of the empire, subtle but powerful. Even emperors, like Marcus Aurelius a generation later, would be nourished by Stoic teachings that bore the unmistakable influence of Epictetus. The slave who once had no voice had become a teacher of rulers. The character of his public emergence also reveals something profound about the nature of influence. Epictetus did not seek fame, and yet his name endured. He did not write books, yet his words survived through the devotion of students. He did not cultivate power, yet his ideas outlasted the emperors who once exiled him. His emergence was not crafted through ambition, but through authenticity. By simply living and speaking what he believed, he created a presence that could not be ignored. This is the paradox of his legacy. The man who claimed nothing gained everything. For modern readers, this stage of his life speaks directly to our own anxieties about public voice and influence. We live in an age obsessed with platforms, followers, and visibility. Yet, Epictetus shows that the most enduring emergence comes not from self-promotion, but from lived integrity. Influence, he reminds us, is not about how loudly you speak, but about how truthfully you live. His public emergence challenges us to reconsider what it means to be seen. Perhaps the most powerful visibility is the quiet force of a life aligned with principle. This phase of his life also invites us to think about the relationship between philosophy and society. Epictetus did not withdraw entirely into solitude, nor did he chase the spotlight of political life. Instead, he created a middle space, a community of practice, where individuals could train themselves to live with freedom and dignity, and then return to their roles in the wider world transformed. His public emergence was not about conquering society, but about seeding it with wisdom through individuals. This strategy ensured that his philosophy would survive not through institutions, but through lives, making it resilient in ways no empire could crush. By the time Epictetus had fully emerged as a public teacher, his philosophy had developed from personal survival into a shared vision, from individual endurance into communal wisdom. His classroom was his pulpit, his exile, his platform, his students, his legacy. The voice that had once belonged only to himself now resonated across the empire, shaping soldiers, statesmen, and eventually emperors. His emergence was not flashy, but it was unstoppable because it was rooted not in circumstance but in truth. In understanding this moment, we see clearly the trajectory of his life. What began as hardship became philosophy. What began as silence became discourse. What began as survival became influence. Epictetus's public emergence marks the point where his ideas stepped fully into history, no longer just the wisdom of one man, but the inheritance of humanity. From here, his work would grow into texts that shaped generations, enduring long after the empire that once exiled him faded into ruin. The irony of Epictetus's legacy is that the man who insisted philosophy must be lived rather than written is remembered through words on a page. He himself did not leave behind volumes of carefully arranged treatises. His philosophy came in spoken bursts, conversations, lectures, pointed challenges offered to his students. The written works we know as the Discourses and the slim but enduring Enchiridion, the Handbook, were not his compositions but the faithful notes of his student Arion. Yet it is precisely through this indirect transmission that his first major work emerged, carrying the pulse of his teaching into permanence. To understand this moment, we must see how a philosophy born in struggle became crystallized into texts that still serve as guides for those confronting life's turbulence. The Discourses, preserved in 4 surviving books out of the original 8, capture the raw immediacy of his teaching. They are not polished essays but living dialogues, transcribed in a way that preserves their rhythm and bluntness. In them, we hear Epictetus rebuke a student for fearing exile, mock another for boasting of memorized doctrines, comfort one who grieves, and challenge another to live up to his own words. The power of these records lies in their unfiltered tone. They are not philosophy as distant speculation, but philosophy as urgent confrontation. Reading them feels like being in the room, sitting on the rough benches of his school in Nicopolis, with the lame philosopher leaning forward, eyes sharp, voice insistent. What will you do when life strikes? Arrian's role in this process cannot be overstated. A statesman and historian in his own right, Arrian devoted himself to preserving his teacher's words with fidelity. He did not reshape them into systematic form or polish them into rhetorical display. Instead, he allowed Epictetus's rough edges to remain. This decision ensured that what we encounter in the discourses is not a filtered image of a Stoic sage, but the living voice of a man who refused to soften truth for the sake of elegance. The fact that a free and prominent Roman would devote himself to preserving the words of a man born into slavery is itself testimony to the force of Epictetus's presence. The significance of the discourses lies not only in their preservation of teaching, but in their demonstration of philosophy as practice. Unlike the works of some Stoics who arrange doctrines into neat categories, Epictetus's words come in the form of conversations about daily life. He does not begin with cosmology or logic, but with the immediate struggles of the human heart: fear, anger, grief, ambition, shame. His first major work, if we can call it that, was not the construction of a system, but the demonstration of philosophy as lived discipline. The discourses became his work because they carried this living practice into the hands of readers far removed from his classroom. Out of the larger discourses, Arrian also distilled the Enchiridion, a concise handbook of Stoic practice. This small text became the portable form of Epictetus's philosophy, a manual one could carry like a spiritual compass. And it contained no ornament, only principles to be remembered and applied. Distinguish what is within your power from what is not. Treat loss as the return of something borrowed. Remember that insult is powerless unless you grant it weight, and so on. The Enchiridion was his philosophy in its purest form, clear, demanding, usable. It spread widely, finding its way into the hands of soldiers, monks, rulers, and ordinary people for centuries. For many, it was their first and only encounter with Stoicism, yet it carried enough force to transform lives. The importance of these works, especially as first major appearances in written form, cannot be overstated. They took the immediacy of his classroom and ensured that his philosophy would not vanish with his death. They bridged the gap between oral teaching and lasting tradition. More importantly, they demonstrated that philosophy need not be grand or complex to be powerful. A short handbook could do what volumes of metaphysics could not: guide a person through the storms of life. What also makes these works remarkable is their accessibility. While many ancient texts require background knowledge of myth, politics, or logic, Epictetus speaks in plain images. He compares life to a banquet where you must take your share without greed, to a play where you must perform your role with dignity, to a ball game where the test is not whether you keep the ball, but how you play when you lose it. These metaphors made philosophy graspable for ordinary people, and they explain why his works traveled so widely across cultures and centuries. His first major work, then, was not only for philosophers, but for anyone struggling to live well. The emergence of these texts also reshaped the meaning of authorship. Though Epictetus did not write them, they are considered his works because they carry his voice so unmistakably. This blurring of authorship highlights an essential truth about his philosophy: the medium is less important than the message, and the message is less important than the life. What matters is not who holds the pen, but whether the words guide the reader toward freedom. In this sense, Epictetus's first major work is not the discourses or the Enchiridion themselves, but the living transformation they continue to produce in readers. The true text of Epictetus is not on parchment, but in the minds and actions of those who practice his teaching. For modern readers, encountering these works can feel like a confrontation with oneself. The bluntness of Epictetus leaves little room for evasion. He asks whether you will tie your peace to the whims of others, whether you will waste energy on what cannot be controlled, whether you will live as though death is far away when it is in fact always near. His words pierce because they come from someone who endured what he speaks of. His first major work is not a monument to intellectual achievement, but a call to personal responsibility. It does not flatter the reader with complex theories. It demands honesty and courage. The legacy of this first major work is immense. Monks in the Middle Ages copied the Enchiridion as a spiritual guide. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered it as a manual for virtue. Enlightenment writers admired its clarity and practical wisdom. Modern soldiers have carried it into war as a source of strength. Across time, the simplicity of its message has continued to strike with force. You cannot control the world, but you can control yourself. That truth, articulated in the earliest preserved words of Epictetus, remains as challenging today as it was in Nicopolis. In reflecting on this stage of his life, we see how Epictetus's philosophy, born in silence and lived in struggle, entered history not through the ambition of authorship, but through the devotion of students. His first major work was not written by his own hand, but it was no less his. It stands as proof that truth does not need polish to endure, and that the voice of one man, even one who wrote nothing, can echo louder and longer than the decrees of emperors. The discourses and the Enchiridion are thus more than texts. They are the survival of a living presence, the crystallization of a philosophy that continues to demand courage from every reader it confronts. When the words of Epictetus began to circulate in the form of Arrian's notes, they carried with them a challenge that could not be ignored. His philosophy was too blunt to be safely admired from a distance, too direct to be enjoyed without discomfort. Those who encountered his teaching, whether in person at Nicopolis or later in written form, were forced into a confrontation. Either you accepted his demand to live differently, or you recoiled from its severity. The critical reception of Epictetus in his own time and in the centuries that followed reveals much about both the man and the world he addressed. Among his students, the reception was often one of deep reverence, even when it came with discomfort. Arrian, whose loyalty preserved the discourses and Enchiridion, describes his teacher not as a distant sage, but as a moral physician. To listen to Epictetus was to undergo treatment, not always pleasant, but necessary for health. Many students were stung by his criticism, chastened by his refusal to let them hide behind clever words or superficial learning. Yet this very severity produced devotion. They recognized in him something rare, a teacher who cared more about their transformation than their admiration. This reception was intimate, rooted in the recognition that his words, though sharp, were meant to heal. In the wider intellectual world, however, the reception was more complex. Rome had long been a place where philosophy and politics intersected uneasily. Philosophers could be admired as ornaments of culture, but when their teachings threatened the stability of power, they were exiled or silenced. His insistence that no external power can enslave the mind was, on one level, comforting. It allowed those under tyranny to endure with dignity. But it was also subversive, for it implied that the authority of emperors was limited, that their supposed dominion was hollow if the human will remained free. It is telling that Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome during Epictetus's lifetime, though he does not appear to have been personally targeted for his words. The very climate of suspicion shaped how his teaching was received, admired by individuals, tolerated cautiously by rulers. The paradox of his reception lies in the fact that while Epictetus himself was not widely celebrated in elite Roman circles, his influence seeped deeply into the cultural bloodstream. His students, many of them young men of rank and means, carried his lessons back into their roles as statesmen, soldiers, and administrators. His philosophy shaped lives quietly, not through public accolades but through private transformation. Over time, this subterranean influence became visible in the Stoic revival that reached its peak in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, who echoed Epictetus's themes in his meditations. To see an emperor adopt the wisdom of a former slave is perhaps the most striking reception of all, a reversal that underscores the universal reach of his teaching. Critics, however, were not absent. Some dismissed Stoicism in general, and Epictetus in particular, as too harsh, too austere, too indifferent to the ordinary joys and griefs of life. To live without clinging, they argued, was to live without warmth. To accept death and loss without protest seemed to them inhuman, even callous. Epictetus anticipated these objections and met them directly. He insisted that his philosophy did not erase feeling, but placed it in proper proportion. Love was not diminished by recognizing mortality, it was purified. Joy was not denied by refusing to cling, it was deepened. Grief was not eliminated, but restrained so it did not consume the one who suffered. Yet, even with these clarifications, some critics remained unconvinced, preferring philosophies that promised comfort rather than discipline. The reception of Epictetus's words among early Christians is also noteworthy. Though he himself was not part of that tradition, his emphasis on inner freedom, on the futility of worldly power, and on the discipline of the soul resonated deeply with Christian thinkers. Monks in the Middle Ages copied the Enchiridion and treated it as a spiritual manual. The sharp Stoic distinction between what belongs to us and what does not found echoes in Christian teachings about detachment from the world and trust in divine providence. In some monasteries, the Enchiridion was second only to Scripture in shaping the daily practice of novices. This reception across traditions underscores the universality of his message. It could be heard and adopted even by those who did not share his metaphysical assumptions. During the Renaissance, Epictetus's reception shifted again. Humanist scholars, seeking to recover the moral wisdom of antiquity, celebrated the clarity of his teaching. His plain metaphors and practical advice stood out amid the ornate rhetoric of other classical texts. To Renaissance readers, Epictetus was not merely a philosopher, but a guide to virtue, a voice that could steady individuals in a world shaken by political upheaval and religious conflict. His works were translated, commented upon, and carried into the libraries of scholars and statesmen alike. The simplicity of the Enchiridion especially appealed to those seeking a moral compass without the complexities of scholastic theology. In the Enlightenment, the reception became more secular. Figures such as Voltaire admired Epictetus for his rational clarity and his rejection of superstition. The idea that freedom resides in the mind appealed strongly to thinkers who sought to ground human dignity in reason rather than divine decree. Yet, even in this rationalist context, some critics found his teaching too passive. They worried that acceptance of fate could lead to resignation rather than reform, to endurance of injustice rather than resistance against it. This critique reflects a tension still felt today. Does Stoicism empower people to act courageously, or does it risk encouraging submission to systems of power? Epictetus himself would likely have answered that true freedom does not mean inaction, but that action must be grounded in clarity, not illusion. In modern times, the reception of Epictetus has been both popular and academic. Psychologists have drawn on his insights as precursors to cognitive behavioral therapy, noting how his emphasis on the interpretation of events anticipates modern strategies for reframing thought. Soldiers have carried the Enchiridion into battle as a source of steadiness in the face of fear. Business leaders quote him to frame resilience in volatile markets. Yet, beyond these utilitarian uses, many ordinary readers find in his words a sense of companionship, a voice that speaks directly to their own anxieties, reminding them that peace is possible even when life refuses to bend. His reception, then, has not been confined to scholars or specialists. It is his accessibility that explains why his influence continues to ripple outward. What unites all these receptions across centuries and contexts is the recognition that Epictetus speaks with a rare authority. Whether admired or criticized, his voice cannot be ignored because it does not permit detachment. To read him is to be addressed personally, to be challenged about how you live and where you place your peace. Critics may argue that his demands are too severe. Admirers may find liberation in his simplicity, but all are forced to respond. This inevitability of engagement is perhaps the truest measure of a philosopher's reception. In considering how his contemporaries, successors, and later readers received him, we see that Epictetus never sought applause, yet he received something greater: endurance. His philosophy was not celebrated in grand monuments during his lifetime, but it was lived, copied, transmitted, and returned to again and again. His words, sharpened in the furnace of hardship, have continued to pierce the hearts of those who, centuries later, faced crises not so different from his own. That, more than acclaim or criticism, is the true measure of how his first works were received. They became not relics but companions, surviving as living voices in the hands of anyone seeking freedom, in a world that still resists control. The picture of Epictetus that history often preserves is one of serenity, an unshakable philosopher who met the violence of slavery, the indignities of poverty, and the uncertainty of exile with a calm that astonished his students. But to reduce him to this image alone would be to miss the complexity of his life. He was no stone idol immune to feeling. Beneath the composed exterior, he endured personal struggles that shaped his philosophy as much as they tested it. To understand the depth of his teaching, we must consider not only his triumphs, but also the tensions and difficulties he carried within. His struggles began with the body. The injury to his leg, whether inflicted deliberately by his master or acquired through neglect, left him permanently lame. Physical pain was not an abstraction for him, but a daily companion. Every step would have reminded him of limitation, every movement a reminder of vulnerability. This was no small matter in a culture that prized strength and athleticism. To appear weak in body could mean to be dismissed in voice, to be seen as less than whole. Epictetus had to wrestle with this stigma even as he taught that the body is not the true self. His philosophy of detachment from bodily conditions was born not of speculation, but of necessity. To live with a crippled leg in a society that celebrated power meant constantly deciding that dignity lay elsewhere. Yet even with this resolve, he must have known moments of frustration, times when the pain intruded, when fatigue threatened his composure. His teaching, that suffering is an opportunity for training, was forged in the crucible of his own physical trials. Material poverty was another ongoing struggle. Unlike philosophers born into wealth, Epictetus lived with little for most of his life. He never amassed possessions, nor did he seek them, but the deprivation was real. Poverty meant cold winters with inadequate shelter, hunger that visited uninvited, and the vulnerability of having no resources to cushion life's blows. His later decision to live simply was not merely a stoic exercise, but also a continuation of a condition he had known since childhood. To call poverty indifferent was not to trivialize it, but to insist that it could not define his worth. Yet poverty is never easy. His philosophy was, at times, a shield against despair, a way of asserting control when circumstances offered none. Exile, too, was part of his struggle. When Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome, Epictetus was forced to leave the city where he had studied, taught, and found his first community. For a man whose life had already been marked by instability, exile must have reopened old wounds of displacement. To be uprooted, to lose the familiarity of one's surroundings, to start again in a foreign city. These are not minor disruptions, but deep challenges to one's sense of belonging. Yet, once again, he framed the experience as an opportunity. If life assigns you the role of exile, he taught, then play it well. Still, the pain of starting over, the loneliness of departure, the uncertainty of acceptance in a new place would have been felt acutely. His insistence that home is found within the mind was not a convenient slogan, but a hard-won survival strategy. Beyond these external conditions, Epictetus faced the more subtle but equally demanding struggle of integrity. As his reputation grew, so did the temptation to compromise. Teachers in Rome often softened their words to please patrons or to curry favor with powerful audiences. Epictetus refused. He spoke bluntly, risking unpopularity even among his own students. But this refusal carried its own weight. To stand firm against social pressure requires constant vigilance, a daily recommitment to principle. He must have known moments of doubt, questions about whether his severity would alienate his listeners, whether his refusal to flatter would leave him isolated. His struggle here was the struggle of every teacher who insists on truth over comfort. Another dimension of his struggle lay in the tension between philosophy and feeling. He taught that we must not be enslaved by grief, yet he himself raised an abandoned child late in life. This act of care, as noble as it was, surely brought with it the vulnerability of love, the fear of loss, the ache of responsibility. For a man who had long insisted on detachment, the daily reality of fatherhood must have pressed against his own teachings. Did he lie awake at night worrying about the child's future? Did he feel anxiety when illness threatened? The philosophy that guided him did not erase these emotions, but taught him to hold them differently. Still, to live what he preached was no small struggle. His life demonstrates that philosophy is not about eliminating feeling, but about negotiating it with courage. He also wrestled with the perception of Stoicism itself. Critics accuse the Stoics of coldness, of denying the sweetness of life in their insistence on discipline. Epictetus had to carry this burden, knowing that his words could be misread as harshness. His struggle was to remain faithful to clarity without becoming caricatured as unfeeling. He knew that his teaching could sound severe, but he also knew that only severity could cut through the illusions that bound people. Balancing compassion with bluntness was a constant tension in his role as teacher. His struggle was not simply to speak truth, but to speak it in a way that would awaken rather than crush. Perhaps his deepest personal struggle was with the weight of memory. Born into slavery, he could never erase the experiences of humiliation, violence, and loss that had marked his early years. Memory is not so easily mastered as circumstance. He may have trained his mind to accept the present and to anticipate death without fear, but the past is not subject to the same discipline. The scars of early life linger, even for philosophers. His teaching, that we must release what we cannot control, included, for him, the burden of remembering injustices he could not undo. The serenity his students admired was not an absence of struggle, but a victory, won daily against the ghosts of memory. When we consider these struggles together, bodily pain, poverty, exile, integrity, love, memory, we see Epictetus not as a remote sage, but as a profoundly human figure. His philosophy was not built in the ivory tower of abstraction, but in the trenches of lived difficulty. Each principle he taught was tested first in his own life, each maxim hammered out on the anvil of experience. His struggles did not discredit his philosophy, they authenticated it. The fact that he continued to speak of freedom while limping, to speak of wealth's irrelevance while poor, to speak of peace while exiled, gives his words their force. They are not theories, but testimonies. This recognition also reshapes how we receive him today. Too often, we treat philosophers as finished portraits, their teachings as pristine doctrines detached from the mess of life. But Epictetus reminds us that philosophy is born in struggle and must remain entangled with it. His life is proof that wisdom does not mean the absence of difficulty, but the courage to live truthfully within it. His struggles did not undermine his philosophy, they were the soil from which it grew. And in seeing this, we recognize our own place in his story. For we too live with pain, poverty, exile of various kinds, the pull of love, the scars of memory. His life tells us that philosophy is not about escaping these struggles, but about learning to walk through them with dignity. Thus, the personal struggles of Epictetus are not footnotes, but central to his legacy. They reveal that the philosopher was not immune to the wounds of life, but was shaped by them. They remind us that the authority of his words comes not from detachment, but from endurance. And they invite us, in our own struggles, to see not only threats, but training grounds, not only burdens, but opportunities to practice freedom. In this way, his life continues to offer more than maxims. It offers companionship, the assurance that wisdom is forged not apart from suffering, but within it. Epictetus's philosophy did not arrive fully formed, the moment he limped from his master's household into freedom. Like all living thought, it matured, shifted emphasis, and deepened as he encountered new challenges and new audiences. To see his philosophy as static is to misunderstand its very nature, for he insisted that philosophy is practice, and practice always evolves. His teachings reveal a trajectory that mirrors the arc of his own life, from survival to stability, from personal endurance to communal guidance, from private insight to universal principle. In the earliest layers of his thought, forged under slavery and hardship, the emphasis fell almost entirely on control and non-control. This distinction was the ground on which everything else rested. He urged his listeners to begin here. If you confuse these categories, nothing else will follow. His early teaching sounded like survival instruction. Focus only on what you can command, your will and your judgments, and refuse to waste energy on externals. It was stripped down, bare, designed to stabilize a soul living under constant threat. For those who knew oppression firsthand, this message was liberation. Freedom is still possible, even here. But as his circumstances changed, no longer enslaved, later a teacher with students seeking guidance, his philosophy expanded. The core distinction remained, but he began to integrate questions of duty, community, and purpose. To live free internally was not enough, one had to live rightly in relation to others. He began to stress the roles we are given in life: the parent, the citizen, the friend, the exile, as assignments from a larger order. You cannot control the role, he insisted, but you can control how you play it. This shift reveals a philosophical evolution from a focus on endurance to a focus on performance, from inner stability to outer responsibility. His exile from Rome accelerated this development. In Nicopolis, away from the imperial capital and its constant reminders of power, he built a school that became both refuge and laboratory. Surrounded by students eager to learn, he could no longer teach survival alone. He had to articulate a fuller vision of the good life. Here, his philosophy grew more comprehensive. He emphasized not only discipline of desire and aversion, but also cultivation of character, love of humanity, and reverence for the divine order. The Stoic cosmos became more than background. It became the context in which freedom and duty found their harmony. Another mark of his evolution was his increasing focus on community. While earlier lessons emphasized detachment from externals, his later teachings stressed our obligations as social beings. He reminded his students that no person is an island, that we are each threads in the fabric of the whole. To neglect this truth was to betray the role assigned to us by nature. Yet, even here, he maintained his central insight. Obligations must be fulfilled freely, not from fear or compulsion. His evolution was not from detachment to attachment, but from detachment to responsible engagement. This balanced care without clinging, duty without enslavement, represents the maturity of his philosophy. As his teaching matured, so too did his treatment of love. Early on, he warned bluntly that attachment brings suffering, urging students to remember the mortality of loved ones and the fragility of bonds. Later, while still emphasizing impermanence, he softened the edges with greater compassion. To love someone, while remembering they can be lost, is not to diminish love, but to heighten it. The fragility of life makes connection more urgent, not less. This evolution from stark warning to tender instruction reflects his own growth and experience, perhaps shaped by raising the child he adopted. Philosophy, for him, was not static doctrine, but a conversation between principle and lived reality. The tone of his teaching also evolved. Early accounts describe him as stern, even harsh, with students. But as time passed, his words took on more humor, more patience, even a gentleness that had once been less apparent. He still rebuked sharply when needed, but he balanced rebuke with encouragement. His evolution as a teacher reveals the truth of his own philosophy. Practice produces progress. Just as he demanded growth from his students, he himself grew in the art of guiding others. His evolution as a philosopher was inseparable from his evolution as a human being. This trajectory is mirrored in the way his works were received. The discourses capture the immediacy of a man confronting life's daily crises. The Enchiridion, however, reflects distillation, a later stage where the essentials could be compressed into a handbook. The movement from sprawling dialogue to concise manual reveals his philosophical evolution, from exploration to essence, from raw confrontation to portable wisdom. His legacy shows a man who refined his thought continuously, stripping away excess until only the core remained. Modern readers can trace in this evolution a model for our own growth. We often begin philosophy in crisis, seeking stability when life feels chaotic. At first, the goal is survival. How can I stop being ruled by fear, anger, or despair? But as stability grows, the questions deepen. How should I live with others? How should I fulfill my roles? How should I love without fear? Epictetus's life charts this path. He shows that philosophy is not merely the first step of endurance, but the long arc of maturation, leading to wisdom that embraces both freedom and responsibility. Another striking feature of his evolution is his increasingly spiritual dimension. While always rooted in Stoic rationality, his later teachings contain greater emphasis on the divine order of the universe. He spoke of God not as an abstract principle, but as the author of the play in which we are actors. To resist our role, he argued, is to resist God's will. To embrace it is to live in harmony with the cosmos. This turn does not diminish the practical clarity of his teaching, but deepens it, grounding the discipline of daily life in a sense of cosmic belonging. His philosophy evolved from a survival strategy into a spiritual practice, from self-defense against chaos into alignment with a larger order. The significance of his evolution lies in its authenticity. He did not abandon his core insights, he deepened them. He did not contradict his early teaching, he expanded it. The man who once taught survival to the enslaved later taught dignity to the free, responsibility to the powerful, compassion to the grieving. His philosophy was alive because it grew, because he allowed life to shape it continuously. This growth ensured that his teaching could meet students in whatever stage they found themselves, whether desperate for survival, struggling with duty, or seeking harmony with the universe. In reflecting on his philosophical evolution, we see the full arc of a life transformed by discipline. From the silence of a slave, he became the voice of a teacher. From the fragility of poverty, he built the strength of simplicity. From the private endurance of hardship, he grew into the public guide of communities. His philosophy did not harden into rigidity, but unfolded into depth. And in this unfolding, it gained the resilience to endure across centuries, because it was never bound to circumstance, but always open to growth. Thus, the evolution of Epictetus's thought is not a footnote, but the very heart of his legacy. It demonstrates that philosophy is not a possession, but a practice, not a finished doctrine, but a lifelong training. His teachings remind us that growth is possible even under chains, that wisdom can mature even in exile, that philosophy is never done, but always becoming. And in this ongoing becoming, Epictetus remains alive, not as a figure frozen in history, but as a companion urging us to continue evolving, to refine our lives until they too embody freedom and dignity. Every philosopher who dares to speak with clarity courts controversy, and Epictetus was no exception. His life and teaching unsettled people precisely because they were so uncompromising. He asked his students, and, by extension, all who would listen to relinquish illusions they clung to as the foundation of their security. He confronted the powerful with the limits of their power, the wealthy with the emptiness of their wealth, and the ambitious with the futility of their striving. In doing so, he inevitably collided with the expectations of his society. His controversies were not scandals of personal misconduct, but storms of resistance stirred by truths that cut too deeply. The most obvious controversy surrounding his life was his connection to the expulsion of philosophers from Rome under Domitian in 93 CE. While Epictetus himself does not appear to have been personally targeted, the climate of hostility toward philosophy shaped his trajectory. Domitian, like other rulers before him, feared philosophers because they challenged the ideology of absolute authority. By insisting that inner freedom cannot be taken, Epictetus undermined the myth of imperial omnipotence. His teaching that the emperor himself could be enslaved by fear or desire was a subtle but sharp critique of tyranny. In a world where emperors demanded reverence as gods, such a message could not help but be controversial. Beyond politics, his philosophy provoked controversy among rival schools of thought. Epicureans emphasized the pursuit of pleasure as the highest good, while skeptics counseled suspension of judgment to avoid error. Epictetus dismissed both paths with bluntness. To pursue pleasure, he argued, is to chase what you cannot control, to tie your peace to the most fragile and fleeting of externals. To suspend judgment endlessly is to paralyze the will, to avoid the responsibility of choosing how to live. His critiques angered some contemporaries who saw in his severity a rejection of more balanced or human approaches. Yet his rejection was consistent. Anything that enslaved the mind to externals was, in his view, a betrayal of freedom. The controversy extended to his approach to emotions. Many who encountered his teaching recoiled at the idea that grief, anger, and fear should be disciplined rather than indulged. To parents who had lost children, his counsel to remember that all we love is mortal could sound harsh, even cruel. To those humiliated by insult, his insistence that the insult has no power unless you grant it could feel dismissive. The controversy lay not in the truth of his words, but in their demand. People wanted comfort, he offered clarity. They wanted sympathy that reinforced their attachment. He offered freedom that required letting go. This was too much for some, and it created the impression, then and now, that Stoicism is cold. Yet perhaps the deepest controversy of his philosophy lay in its redefinition of power. Roman society was built on hierarchy: master over slave, citizen over foreigner, emperor over all. Epictetus inverted this order. He declared that the slave, if he mastered himself, was free, while the emperor, if ruled by fear, was a slave. Such a reversal struck at the very heart of Roman ideology. To the proud, it was an insult; to the humble, a revelation. The controversy was inevitable because it exposed the hollowness of the system. His words carried the radical implication that dignity belongs to all, regardless of status, and that no external force can grant or take it away. In a society obsessed with rank, this was revolutionary, and revolutions always provoke resistance. His rejection of hypocrisy also stirred discontent. Epictetus was relentless in calling out those who spoke of philosophy but lived contrary to it. He mocked students who memorized maxims but panicked when fortune turned against them. He dismissed the admiration of philosophers who sought applause rather than transformation. This created friction even within his own circles. Many came to his school expecting eloquence and left feeling chastised. His unwillingness to soften truth created controversy among those who preferred philosophy as intellectual ornament rather than moral demand. But for Epictetus, compromise would have been betrayal. Philosophy was not theater, it was training for life. The controversy surrounding his philosophy did not diminish after his death. In later centuries, critics accused Stoicism of encouraging passivity in the face of injustice. By teaching acceptance of what cannot be controlled, did Epictetus encourage submission to oppressive systems? Some argued that his counsel to endure rather than resist made him a philosopher of resignation, one whose wisdom comforted the oppressed but left the structures of oppression intact. Others countered that his philosophy did the opposite. It armed individuals with an invincible freedom, empowering them to face tyranny without fear. The debate continues even now, as readers wrestle with whether Stoicism fosters resilience or quietism. Another source of controversy lies in his views on divine order. Epictetus taught that the universe is governed by a rational will, often identified with God, and that our duty is to align ourselves with this order. To some, this was a source of strength, grounding freedom in cosmic belonging. To others, it seemed to excuse suffering as divinely ordained. Critics charged that his belief in providence could justify the status quo, even when unjust. But Epictetus himself never used providence to defend cruelty. He insisted instead that while the order of the cosmos is beyond us, our freedom lies in how we play our part. The controversy was less about his intent and more about how later readers interpreted his words. Despite these tensions, or perhaps because of them, his philosophy endured. The very controversies that made some reject him made others embrace him with greater fervor. Those who longed for comfort dismissed him as harsh. Those who longed for truth found him liberating. His insistence on responsibility offended the complacent, but empowered the courageous. His rejection of illusion angered those who preferred flattery, but inspired those who wanted freedom. In every controversy, the dividing line was the same: those willing to face reality gravitated toward him, while those who resisted it turned away. For modern audiences, these controversies remain alive. The question of whether his philosophy empowers or pacifies is still debated. In workplaces, in therapy, in political thought, people wrestle with whether acceptance of what cannot be controlled liberates us or keeps us docile. The controversy about emotion remains as well. Does disciplining grief make us strong or dehumanize us? Epictetus continues to provoke precisely because he refuses to let us settle for easy answers. His words demand that we test them in our own lives, and in that testing lies both the controversy and the enduring relevance. The major controversies surrounding Epictetus reveal not a man who sought conflict, but one who could not avoid it. To speak truth in a world of illusion is always to stir resistance. To proclaim that freedom belongs even to the enslaved is to challenge empires. To insist that peace lies not in wealth, but in virtue, is to expose the emptiness of privilege. His controversies are the measure of his courage, the evidence that his philosophy was alive enough to disturb. And if his words still unsettle us today, it is not because they are outdated, but because they remain uncomfortably true. There comes a stage in the life of every thinker when early insights, sharpened by hardship and clarified by teaching, begin to ripen into something richer. For Epictetus, this ripening did not mean abandoning his earlier convictions. Rather, it meant carrying them further, testing them against the complexities of human existence, and allowing them to grow into wisdom that reached beyond mere survival. His voice, which had once spoken with the urgency of a man teaching people to endure, now carried the resonance of someone who understood how to live, not just bravely, but meaningfully. This deepening of wisdom was the natural culmination of a life forged in suffering and refined in teaching. One of the marks of this deepening was the way he came to frame the distinction between what is in our control and what is not. Early on, this principle had the character of a survival rule. Do not waste your energy on what you cannot change, or you will be destroyed by disappointment. In his later years, the principle grew into something more profound. It became a way of seeing the world as a whole, an ordering of reality that allowed for acceptance and harmony. The boundary between controllable and uncontrollable was no longer simply a matter of strategy. It was a doorway into peace. To recognize this boundary was to step into alignment with the structure of the cosmos itself. The insight had matured from a tactic of survival into a vision of wisdom. His wisdom also deepened in how he spoke about love and loss. The younger Epictetus was blunt, even severe, warning students to remember at every moment the mortality of those they loved. To modern ears, this can sound harsh, as if love must be constantly overshadowed by fear of death. But in his later teachings, the tone shifts. He began to describe love not as possession, but as participation, not as clinging, but as cherishing. To love a child, a partner, or a friend, while knowing they could be taken at any moment, was no longer simply a reminder of detachment. It was an invitation to gratitude. Love was deepened, not diminished, by awareness of fragility. In this way, his wisdom moved beyond protection from grief into a fuller embrace of life's beauty, precisely because it was fleeting. The same pattern appears in his reflections on duty. At first, his emphasis was on individual freedom, the sovereignty of the mind against external control. But over time, he came to stress more strongly our obligations to one another. Every human being, he taught, is part of a greater whole, like a limb of a body or a citizen of a universal city. To live wisely is not only to free oneself from illusion, but also to play one's part in the larger order with integrity. The parent must care for the child, the friend must support the friend, the citizen must serve the community. This did not weaken his insistence on detachment. It enriched it, turning freedom into responsibility. The Stoic ideal of cosmopolitanism, the sense that all people belong to a single moral community, became more prominent in his later teaching, showing the broadening of his vision from self to society. Another sign of his deepening wisdom was his treatment of suffering itself. Early on, he framed suffering primarily as exercise, a test of resilience. Later, he came to see it also as teacher. Hardship was not only something to be endured, but something to be learned from, a voice of reality stripping away illusions. Every pain, every setback, every insult became an instructor, pointing us back to what matters most. This subtle shift reveals maturity, where once he saw suffering as an obstacle to overcome, he later saw it as a partner in the formation of character. Such a view does not romanticize pain, but acknowledges its role in awakening us to truth. His teaching about death likewise reveals the richness of maturity. The young Epictetus taught that death is nothing to fear because it is beyond our control. Later, he spoke of death with a calmer, almost reverent tone. Death was not simply neutral, it was natural, part of the larger order in which we participate. To fear, it was to resist nature. To accept, it was to live in harmony with the cosmos. In this way, his wisdom expanded from individual resilience into cosmic perspective. Death was no longer merely something not to fear, it was something that gave life its shape, its urgency, its dignity. Perhaps the clearest sign of his deepening wisdom was the way his teaching became less about confrontation and more about guidance. In his early discourses, he often rebuked his students sharply, cutting through their excuses with biting clarity. As he aged, though still direct, he began to balance rebuke with encouragement. His wisdom was no longer only the surgeon's scalpel, but also the healer's hand. He had learned that transformation comes not just from severity, but from patience, not just from exposing illusion, but from nurturing courage. His philosophy remained demanding, but it became gentler, more compassionate, reflecting the depth of a man who had seen enough of life to know that truth must be offered with care. The deepening of his wisdom also showed in the way he spoke of providence. Where once he emphasized only human responsibility, he later spoke more of the divine order of the universe. He described life as a play directed by God, in which we are assigned our roles. Wisdom, he taught, lies in playing the role given to us with excellence, whether short or long, grand or humble. This metaphor of life as theater captured a mature understanding. We do not control the script, but we control our performance. The point is not to envy another's role, but to perform our own with dignity. Such teaching reveals not only discipline, but serenity, the peace of someone who has reconciled himself to the ultimate order of things. The richness of his later wisdom lies in its balance. He never abandoned the sternness that made him formidable, but he combined it with tenderness. He never surrendered the rigor of self-mastery, but he wove it together with compassion for others. He never ceased insisting on the limits of control, but he came to frame those limits not only as boundaries, but as gifts, reminders that life is to be embraced rather than hoarded. This balance is the fruit of maturity, the mark of philosophy that has lived long enough to temper steel with warmth. For us, his deepening wisdom is what makes him not just a philosopher of survival, but a companion in the art of living. In moments of crisis, his early bluntness steadies us. Focus on what you can control, let go of the rest. In moments of reflection, his later maturity invites us to gratitude, to tenderness, to a broader vision of belonging. His life shows that philosophy does not stagnate but grows, that even the strongest insights must be tested and enriched by time. His wisdom matured as he matured, and that is why it continues to speak not only to the desperate, but to the reflective, not only to those in crisis, but to those seeking meaning. The deepening of Epictetus's wisdom also explains why his voice endures across cultures and centuries. It offers both the sharp edge of truth and the soft hand of guidance, both the clarity of principle and the warmth of compassion. His philosophy matured into something more than a shield. It became a compass, pointing not only to survival, but to flourishing. In his life, we see the transformation of endurance into serenity, of clarity into wisdom, of philosophy into a way of being that continues to illuminate the path for all who seek freedom in a world that resists it. Although Epictetus never set pen to parchment in the manner of other great philosophers, the words that came to define his legacy crystallized later in life through the devotion of his student Arrian. By the time Epictetus's school at Nicopolis had grown into a destination for men from across the empire, the voice of the lame philosopher had become not just a private counsel, but a body of teaching that demanded preservation. These later works, chiefly the discourses as preserved in multiple books and the distilled Enchiridion, were not works, in the traditional sense of carefully crafted literary projects. They were records of a living voice, spoken with urgency and sharpened by age, that had ripened into full maturity. And in them we encounter Epictetus, not as the survivor of hardship alone, but as the seasoned guide who had spent decades refining his principles in conversation with others. The discourses reveal a man whose wisdom had deepened with time. The tone is confident, sometimes playful, always unflinching. They capture him addressing real people with real dilemmas, a student worried about exile, another distressed by grief, another proud of memorizing doctrines but failing to live them. Unlike abstract treatises, these words pulse with immediacy. They are the voice of a teacher who has grown weary of excuses and ornament, who demands not admiration, but change. The later books of the Discourses show Epictetus at the height of his powers, blending sharp critique with humor, weaving metaphors drawn from everyday life, and returning again and again to the central message: freedom belongs to the will, not to the world. The Enchiridion, compiled from these teachings, represents perhaps the most concentrated expression of his philosophy. A slim handbook, it was designed to be carried, memorized, and consulted like a spiritual toolkit. Where the Discourses offered dialogue, the Enchiridion offered maxims, clear, direct, and immediately applicable. Do not demand that events happen as you wish, it counsels, but wish them to happen as they do, and your life will flow smoothly. If you love a vase, remember it is breakable. If you love a person, remember they are mortal. Distinguish what is yours, your judgments, your choices, from what is not, and you will never be enslaved. These later works distilled a lifetime of reflection into sentences that could be carried in the heart as readily as in the hand. The reception of these texts across centuries demonstrates their extraordinary adaptability. In late antiquity, the Enchiridion was adopted not only by Stoics, but also by Christian ascetics, who recognized in its counsel a guide for detachment, humility, and inner freedom. Medieval monks copied and commented on it, seeing in its maxims a wisdom that transcended its pagan origins. In the Renaissance, humanist scholars revived it as a manual for virtue, valuing its clarity in a time of intellectual upheaval. In the Enlightenment, rationalists admired its grounding in reason and its independence from superstition. Soldiers carried it into battle. Ordinary people read it as comfort in grief. Modern psychologists see in it the seeds of cognitive therapy. This breadth of influence stems from the very nature of these later works. They are concise, practical, and rooted in universal human dilemmas. What makes these later works remarkable is their refusal to compromise. Epictetus never softened his demands. He did not promise happiness through wealth, love, or success. He promised freedom through discipline, dignity through acceptance, and peace through clarity. The Enchiridion is bracing precisely because it strips life down to its essentials. It does not flatter the reader, it confronts them. And yet, in its bluntness, many have found liberation. To read its maxims is to hear a voice that refuses to indulge our illusions, a voice that reminds us we are wasting life if we spend it chasing what we cannot control. There is also an important evolution visible in these later works. While the early teachings emphasize survival and endurance, the later texts carry a sense of serenity. Epictetus had grown into the calm of maturity. His analogies, life as a banquet, death as the natural departure of a guest, suffering as training, reveal not just a man fighting for freedom, but one who has discovered it. The harsh edges of earlier severity are still there, but they are tempered by humor, by a sense of proportion, by the confidence of someone who has lived long enough to test his principles and found them unbreakable. The later works are therefore not only teachings, but testimonies, records of a life lived with integrity until the end. The influence of these works also reveals the paradox of Epictetus's legacy. He wrote nothing, yet he is among the most widely read of all Stoic philosophers. He sought no fame, yet his words have shaped emperors, monks, generals, and therapists. He lived with nothing, yet his teachings became treasures passed down through centuries. This paradox reflects the very content of his philosophy. External markers, books, monuments, wealth, are unnecessary if the truth is lived and spoken. His later works endure because they embody that truth, because they arose not from ambition, but from authenticity. For modern readers, the significance of these later works lies in their practicality. They do not require scholarly background to understand. They do not demand allegiance to Stoic cosmology. They demand only the courage to test them in daily life. The reader of the Enchiridion is confronted with choices. Will you tie your peace to the opinions of others, or to your own judgments? Will you waste your life fearing death, or will you accept it and live fully? Will you chase what you cannot control, or cultivate what is truly yours? These are not abstract questions, but daily dilemmas, and that is why the later works remain alive. The very survival of these texts is itself a testament to their power. Many ancient works have vanished, lost to time and neglect. That the words of Epictetus, spoken by a man who owned nothing, preserved by a student, copied by monks, revived by humanists, and carried by soldiers, still reach us today is remarkable. His later works are not relics but living companions, voices that can be heard in boardrooms and battlefields, in hospitals and homes. Their endurance is proof that wisdom, once spoken, has a life beyond the speaker. In reflecting on these works, we see the culmination of Epictetus's journey. What began in silence as the endurance of a child became words that transformed students, and finally, through the devotion of Orion, became texts that outlasted empires. His later works represent not only the maturity of his thought, but the permanence of his influence. They show that philosophy, when lived fully, does not need the hand of the author to endure, only needs the devotion of those who recognize its truth. Thus, the later works of Epictetus are not merely collections of sayings, they are the crystallization of a life. They embody the wisdom of one who had known slavery, exile, pain, and poverty, and who nonetheless discovered freedom. They are the lasting record of a man who refused to compromise, who taught that peace lies not in possessions but in perspective. And in their survival, they continue to extend his voice into every age, reminding us that though we cannot control the world, we can always govern ourselves. To speak of philosophy as if it is merely an abstract discipline is to miss its human toll. For Epictetus, every principle came with a price, and the life he lived bore the weight of those costs. His philosophy was not designed to shield him from sacrifice, but to give him the strength to endure it. Behind the serenity for which he is remembered lies a life marked by deep personal losses, the loss of family ties, the loss of physical ease, the loss of social standing, the loss of comforts most take for granted. These costs did not disprove his teaching, but formed the proving ground of its truth. The first and most obvious cost was the body. His crippled leg, likely the result of brutal treatment and slavery, left him permanently lame. This was not simply a matter of pain, but of identity. In Roman society, physical strength was equated with virtue, vigor, and status. To limp was to carry a visible reminder of vulnerability, a mark that others might mock or dismiss. For Epictetus, every public appearance, every step into the classroom, carried this physical cost. His insistence that the body is not the true self was not speculation, but necessity. The personal cost of injury forced him to locate dignity not in outward appearance, but in inner strength. Yet, even as he taught this, the cost remained. Every step must have reminded him of the violence he had suffered and the limitation he bore. Another cost was poverty. Epictetus never sought wealth, but he also never escaped the deprivation of his early life. He lived simply, with little more than what was necessary, and for him, this simplicity became a deliberate choice. Yet the reality of poverty was not easy. It meant cold winters in Nicopolis, with inadequate clothing, hunger when resources were scarce, and the constant vulnerability of not having material security. His philosophy reframed poverty as freedom from excess, but the cost of deprivation still marked his life. In embracing simplicity, he proved his philosophy, but he also carried the weight of discomfort that came with it. Poverty was not a romantic state, it was a discipline that tested him daily. The social cost of his philosophy was equally significant. Though admired by students and respected by some contemporaries, Epictetus never belonged to the circles of influence that shaped Roman public life. His background as a slave excluded him from the highest ranks of intellectual or political recognition. While others built reputations through writings, offices, and alliances, Epictetus remained on the margins, teaching in a provincial city far from the capital. His voice carried, but his life was marked by a kind of exile from the mainstream. This was the cost of integrity. He would not compromise his principles for patronage, and so he lived without the honors that many philosophers sought. His philosophy valued truth over reputation, but the personal cost was a life lived outside the spotlight of Rome's power. Relationships carried their own costs. To love without clinging, as Epictetus taught, meant accepting impermanence in the most personal of ways. His choice to raise an abandoned child late in life brought both joy and burden. Parenthood is always costly, and for him, without wealth or family support, it demanded sacrifice. His philosophy did not spare him the anxieties of care, the vulnerability of attachment, the sleepless nights of responsibility. He accepted these costs willingly, proving that his teaching did not mean withdrawal from love, but deeper courage in the face of it. Yet the cost remained. To love while knowing the certainty of loss is to carry both tenderness and sorrow. A life of discipline, of refusing illusions, can be isolating. Many sought philosophy for comfort, and when they discovered that Epictetus demanded transformation instead, they turned away. To remain uncompromising meant often standing alone. His insistence on truth over flattery created distance, even among those who admired him. He bore this cost with dignity, but it is clear that such a life carried solitude. The philosopher who taught that freedom lies within still paid the price of living in a world that often preferred illusion to reality. The exile under Domitian was another cost, not only politically but personally. To be uprooted, to leave behind familiar places and communities, is a deep wound. Exile strips away continuity, forcing one to begin again in unfamiliar soil. For Epictetus, this meant building a new life in Nicopolis, creating a school from scratch, and carving out space where philosophy could continue. He framed exile as a role assigned by the larger order, a test of character, but the cost was still real: displacement, disconnection, and the memory of being cast out by the powers of Rome. Even the very structure of his philosophy carried personal costs. To insist on discipline meant constant vigilance. To refuse illusion meant constant confrontation with reality. For most people, small comforts and distractions eased the burden of life, but Epictetus refused them. He did not allow himself the luxury of excuses, and he demanded the same from others. This rigor was freeing, but it was also heavy. The cost of such discipline was the unrelenting demand to live awake, to face each moment without denial. For him, philosophy was not a retreat, but a lifelong labor, and its cost was the absence of ease. We must also consider the cost of reputation after death. While later generations celebrated him, during his own time, Epictetus was not among the most famous or widely honored philosophers. Others wrote grand works, influenced politics directly, or left behind legacies in institutions. Epictetus left no writings of his own, no monuments, no lineage of wealth or power. His teaching survived only through the devotion of Arian. The cost of refusing to seek permanence in externals was the risk that his voice might vanish entirely. That it did not is a testament to the power of truth, but the risk itself was real. His philosophy was entrusted to the memory of others, not to his own hand. And yet, these personal costs are inseparable from the integrity of his philosophy. To live with a crippled leg, in poverty, in exile, without honors, without illusions, and still insist on freedom is to embody the very message he taught. His costs did not undermine his teaching, they authenticated it. The man who spoke of freedom had paid dearly for his words, and that payment gave them weight. Unlike philosophers who lived in comfort and speculated from afar, Epictetus bore in his body and his life the scars of truth. For modern readers, these costs remind us that philosophy is not free. To live with clarity requires sacrifice. To accept reality without illusion costs the comfort of denial. To discipline desire costs the ease of indulgence. To love without clinging costs the illusion of permanence. To stand firm in principle costs popularity and sometimes companionship. Epictetus's life shows us that wisdom is not acquired without price. The costs are real, but so is the freedom that comes with them. Thus, the personal costs of Epictetus's life are not side notes but central chapters in his story. They reveal that philosophy is not about avoiding loss, but about choosing what is worth losing for the sake of freedom. His limp, his poverty, his exile, his solitude, these were not accidents to be hidden, but witnesses to his truth. In carrying them, he proved that peace is possible even when life demands everything. And in seeing his costs, we begin to recognize the price of our own illusions and the possibility of freedom if we dare to let them go. By the later years of his life, Epictetus had passed through the gauntlet of suffering, the rigors of teaching, the controversies of exile, and the costs of poverty and disability. What emerged from this long journey was not a brittle dogmatism, but a philosophy of extraordinary maturity, tempered, balanced, and resilient. His mature philosophy was no longer the raw survival code of his youth, nor merely the stern instruction of his middle years. It had become a comprehensive way of seeing life, one that united discipline with compassion, detachment with engagement, and human fragility with cosmic belonging. At the heart of this mature philosophy remained his defining distinction: what is within our control and what is not. But the tone with which he expressed it had shifted. In his early teachings, this principle sounded like a soldier's command: do not waste your strength on battles you cannot win. Later, it became more like an invitation: align your heart with the rhythm of reality, and you will discover peace. The distinction did not change, but the meaning of it deepened. It was no longer simply a strategy for survival. It became the key to harmony, a way of reconciling oneself to the vast order of the cosmos. In his mature vision, freedom was not defined as independence from others or as self-sufficiency alone. Freedom was the capacity to live in accord with nature, to accept one's role in the universal order without resentment. He used the metaphor of a play: we do not choose the script, but we can choose how to perform our part. The dignity of life lies not in its length or prominence, but in the faithfulness with which we inhabit our role. A slave can play his part nobly, an emperor can play his poorly. This reframing liberated individuals from envy and despair, for it made clear that worth is measured not by circumstance, but by character. His philosophy thus matured into a theology of participation, where human beings become co-actors in a drama directed by a divine order. This cosmic perspective gave his later teaching a serenity absent in his earlier severity. Where once he seemed to speak always against illusion and error, now he spoke more often of gratitude and wonder. He encouraged his students to see life as a banquet offered by the gods: take what is given, do not grasp at what is withheld, and above all, enjoy what is present. This image of the banquet expresses the maturity of his thought. It does not deny hunger or absence, but it frames life as gift, however imperfect. To live well is to attend this banquet with humility and joy. His mature philosophy also integrated love more fully. He no longer spoke only of preparing for loss, but of cherishing relationships as expressions of divine order. Every bond, he taught, is entrusted to us for a time, like a guest at the banquet. The mature Epictetus did not urge students to harden themselves against affection, but to deepen it by removing illusion. To love while knowing that love is fragile is not to diminish it, but to make it more precious. This integration of tenderness with detachment represents the fullness of his maturity. He could embrace life's beauty without being enslaved by it. Another hallmark of his mature philosophy was his emphasis on responsibility. While earlier teachings focused heavily on guarding one's own will, his later thought stressed the fulfillment of roles within community. He described each person as a citizen of a larger whole, responsible for justice, kindness, and care. The mature Epictetus did not retreat into isolation. He insisted that philosophy must equip us to serve. To be a philosopher was not to withdraw from society, but to live in it with integrity. In this way, his thought anticipated the modern ideal of citizenship grounded in principle rather than status. The spiritual dimension of his mature philosophy also became more pronounced. To align with this divine order was to live freely. To resist it was to live in chains. His emphasis on providence gave his teaching a note of reverence, even worship. He described himself not as master of his own life, but as a servant of the divine script. This humility, combined with his insistence on personal responsibility, gave his philosophy both strength and softness, a balance between autonomy and surrender that marks true maturity. In practice, his mature philosophy came to resemble a spiritual exercise more than a system of thought. He urged daily reflection, the constant rehearsal of principles, the examination of responses to each event. Philosophy was not a theory to be debated, but a discipline to be lived. His students were to test themselves constantly. Did you grow angry today? Did you waste time fearing the future? Did you cling too tightly to what is not yours? Each failure was not condemnation but training. His mature philosophy thus fused Stoic rigor with a pedagogy of patience. The authority of his later thought lay not in complexity but in clarity. He did not invent new doctrines, nor did he elaborate intricate metaphysical systems. He repeated, refined, and embodied the same truths until they shone with unmistakable power. This consistency is itself a sign of maturity, the ability to recognize that truth is not always new, but always needs to be lived more deeply. The mature Epictetus was less concerned with originality than with authenticity. He did not seek to dazzle, he sought to transform. For modern readers, the maturity of his philosophy is what makes it so enduring. In moments of crisis, his blunt maxims offer stability. In moments of reflection, his cosmic vision offers perspective. In moments of joy, his reminder of impermanence offers gratitude. His mature philosophy addresses the full range of human experience, because it was forged in the full range of his own. It can comfort the grieving, steady, the anxious, humble, the proud, and encourage the weary. This breath is the fruit of a life lived long enough to see both suffering and serenity, and to weave them into a single vision of freedom. The personal authority of his mature philosophy cannot be overstated. Unlike thinkers who wrote in comfort and speculated from safety, Epictetus spoke as one who had endured chains, exile, poverty, and loss. His maturity was not abstract, but embodied. When he said that peace is possible even in adversity, he spoke as one who had lived it. This authenticity gave his mature philosophy a force that theories alone could never have. His life was his argument, and his maturity was his proof. Thus, the mature philosophy of Epictetus represents the culmination of a life of struggle and teaching. It is at once simple and profound, stern and tender, practical and cosmic. It insists on discipline, yet allows for compassion, demands detachment, yet celebrates love, renounces illusion, yet embraces gratitude. It is philosophy not only for survival but for flourishing, not only for crisis but for the fullness of life. And it endures because it speaks to what is most universal in us, our longing to be free in a world we cannot control, and our need to find meaning in a life that is always fragile. The closing years of Epictetus's life unfolded not in the political frenzy of Rome, nor in the gilded halls of privilege, but in the relative quiet of Nicopolis, where his school had become a beacon for seekers across the empire. If the early chapters of his life had been dominated by survival, and the middle years by teaching and controversy, the final stage reflected the steady rhythm of a man who had fully embraced his philosophy. These years were not free of challenge, but they carried the serenity of someone who had reconciled himself to the order of things, who had learned to live as though every day could be his last, and who faced the approach of death with the calm of a traveler preparing to return home. One of the most striking details of his final years is his decision to establish something resembling a family. For much of his life, Epictetus had remained unmarried, embodying the Stoic commitment to simplicity and independence. But later in life, he took in a woman, perhaps a wife or companion, and adopted an abandoned child, raising the infant as his own. This choice has long fascinated historians and admirers, for it demonstrates that even a philosopher so insistent on detachment did not reject the responsibilities of love and care. On the contrary, it reveals the tenderness beneath his philosophy. He was willing, in his old age, to bind himself to others, not out of illusion, but out of duty and compassion. It is easy to imagine him rocking the child to sleep or instructing the woman who shared his household with the same clarity he offered his students, weaving philosophy into the very fabric of domestic life. These final years also show us a man who had achieved a remarkable consistency between his teaching and his living. Visitors to Nicopolis described him as living simply, without ornament or luxury. His house contained little more than the essentials. He ate plain food, wore modest clothes, and accepted his crippled body without complaint. What he had preached to generations of students, that happiness comes not from wealth, power, or external honors, but from aligning one's will with nature. he now embodied daily. The harmony between his words and his life gave his presence a quiet authority. Students who came from far-off provinces seeking wisdom would not have found a man insulated by privilege, but one who lived as plainly as the poorest among them. His philosophy was never abstract in those final years. It was visible in every gesture, every choice, every silence. The school he had founded continued to flourish during this time, attracting young men from across the empire. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation, still others because they had heard whispers of a teacher who could steady the heart against fear. In Epictetus, they encountered not only stern rebukes but also the patience of an older man who had seen much of life. His teaching grew more seasoned, less sharp with rebuke, more balanced with encouragement. Though he still demanded rigor, he now spoke with the serenity of someone who knew his own days were numbered and who wanted to leave behind the clearest possible legacy. His voice in those years carried not only urgency but also gentleness, as though preparing his students for the time when he would no longer be with them. The political climate of Rome during his later life shifted as well. Domitian's persecution of philosophers had ended, and under Nerva and later Trajan, philosophy regained a measure of respect. Nicopolis, though far from the capital, was a place of relative safety, allowing Epictetus to continue his teaching without fear of exile or suppression. This political reprieve provided space for his philosophy to deepen, and it allowed his words to spread more widely. The irony of his life is that though he had been forced from Rome, the exile became the soil in which his most lasting influence grew. The years in Nicopolis, including his final ones, ensured that his philosophy was not snuffed out by imperial suspicion, but preserved in the memory of students like Arrian who would carry it forward. As the end of his life approached, Epictetus spoke often of death. For him, death was not an enemy, but a companion, always near, always reminding him of what mattered. His metaphors capture the calm of his later years, life as a play, and death as the signal to leave the stage, life as a banquet, and death as the gentle dismissal of a guest who has had his share. He counseled his students not to fear this departure, for it is no more unnatural than the setting of the sun. In his own acceptance of mortality, he gave them an example of how to live free of terror. To imagine him in those years is to picture a man who faced his end not with defiance or dread, but with gratitude for having played his part. What stands out about these final years is how fully his philosophy had ripened into serenity. The young slave who once endured violence and humiliation had become an elder whose very presence conveyed peace. His crippled leg, once a symbol of suffering, was now a reminder of resilience. His poverty, once deprivation, had become chosen simplicity. His exile, once a wound, had become a home. Every cost he had borne was transmuted into wisdom, every loss into freedom. By the end, Epictetus was not merely a philosopher teaching freedom, he was freedom embodied, proof that philosophy can turn the harshest of lives into the most meaningful of journeys. The adoption of a child in these years carries symbolic weight. For a man who had been deprived of parental care in his own childhood, the decision to raise an abandoned infant represents a full-circle act of redemption. It demonstrates that philosophy, at its height, does not harden us against life, but softens us into acts of love. His choice suggests that the highest form of wisdom is not detachment for its own sake, but engagement without fear. To raise a child knowing the certainty of loss is to live. Stoicism at its most profound, cherishing what is given without demanding that it last. In these final years, Epictetus's legacy was already being secured through Arrian's work. The younger man preserved his teacher's words with a devotion that reveals the depth of their bond. Arrian's writings ensure that even as Epictetus's body aged and his voice grew quieter, his teaching continued to live. In this sense, the final years of Epictetus were not only about closure, but also about transmission. He had trained not only individuals, but also a movement of thought, planting seeds that would grow long after his death. To imagine Epictetus in his last days is to picture a man sitting quietly in a modest room, perhaps with a child he had adopted playing nearby, perhaps with a student asking a final question. He would have answered not with sentimentality, but with clarity, reminding them that death is simply part of the order of things, that loss is natural, that freedom lies in governing the will. His final years were not dramatic but steady, not marked by scandal but by constancy. This constancy, this seamless alignment of word and life, is what makes his end as meaningful as his beginning. Thus, the final years of Epictetus reveal a man who had come to embody the very truths he taught. They show us philosophy not as theory, but as a lived art, carried out day by day in the simplest of circumstances. They remind us that maturity is not found in escape from responsibility, but in embracing it with clarity, that peace is not the absence of loss, but the acceptance of it, and that the end of life is not tragedy, but fulfillment when it has been lived with integrity. In his final years, Epictetus gave the world not only words but an example, a vision of what it means to live and die free. The life of Epictetus, like the philosophy he spent decades shaping and teaching, ends quietly, without the drama of executions, assassinations, or forced suicides that marked the deaths of other philosophers of antiquity. Unlike Socrates, who drank hemlock in defiance of Athens, or Seneca, who was compelled by Nero to open his veins, Epictetus's death seems to have come naturally, in old age, in Nicopolis, far from the centers of power. And yet, the very absence of spectacle surrounding his death is itself significant. It mirrors the essence of his teaching. Death is neither tragedy nor triumph, neither catastrophe nor reward, but a natural transition, part of the order of things. His quiet passing is the perfect culmination of a life spent teaching that peace lies not in controlling fate, but in accepting it with dignity. The details of his final days are scarce. Ancient sources provide only the faintest outline. There are no dramatic speeches recorded, no letters to friends or disciples, no courtroom testimonies. This silence aligns perfectly with his philosophy. Epictetus taught that death is nothing more than the end of our role in the play, that we ought not to crave a grand exit or fear a humble one. What matters is not how death arrives, but how we meet it. The lack of surviving accounts, rather than diminishing his legacy, preserves the purity of his message. His life itself was the teaching, and his death required no embellishment. We know that by the time of his death, he had already established a household, unusual for him, with a woman and a child under his care. This fact lends a human tenderness to his final chapter. The philosopher who had begun life abandoned as a slave, ended life as a caretaker, ensuring that another child would not grow up discarded. It is moving to imagine that in his last days he was not surrounded by political turmoil or violent decree, but by the domestic simplicity of a home he had chosen. His final breath may well have been witnessed not by emperors or executioners, but by those who loved him quietly, those who had shared his life, not for status, but for companionship. Though his death was unmarked by spectacle, it carried profound symbolic weight. For a man who had spent his life teaching acceptance of fate, the manner of his departure was itself a final lesson. The fact that he died naturally, away from Rome's political storms, underscores the core of his philosophy, that the true arena of life is not in external drama, but in the internal mastery of the will. Where others' deaths became symbols of political resistance or submission, Epictetus's became an affirmation of stillness. He did not need martyrdom to prove his point. His life had already been testimony enough. Seneca, wealthy and entangled with imperial politics, died dramatically, his death staged as a philosophical performance. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, died on campaign, surrounded by soldiers and the machinery of empire. Epictetus, by contrast, died as he lived, simply, quietly, without pomp. This contrast reveals the uniqueness of his path. While other Stoics navigated the complexities of power, Epictetus remained outside its reach, and in so doing he embodied the very independence he taught. His death circumstances highlight this difference. His freedom lay not in political acts, but in the serenity of detachment. The absence of drama in his passing also invites reflection on how we perceive the meaning of death. Modern culture often prizes the extraordinary grand gestures, final words, heroic endings. Epictetus would have dismissed such concerns. To him, the measure of a life was not in the manner of its ending, but in the integrity of its living. A quiet death is not a failure of legacy, but a vindication of it, for it shows that one did not need spectacle to secure meaning. His death becomes a lesson in humility, reminding us that the truest dignity lies not in how others narrate our end, but in how we have lived each day leading to it. Still, the silence around his death did not mean his influence vanished. On the contrary, the preservation of his teachings by Arian ensured that his voice would outlast the empires that had once enslaved and exiled him. The absence of a dramatic death left room for his philosophy itself to take center stage. The words of the discourses and the Enchiridion became his true memorial, shaping generations far beyond the modest circumstances of his burial. The quietness of his end became paradoxically louder than any staged death could have been, because it left behind not an image of a moment, but a guide for a lifetime. It is also worth noting how fitting this manner of death was in light of his own metaphors. He often spoke of life as a play, with God as the playwright, and of death as the moment when the director dismisses the actor from the stage. He warned his students not to cling to their roles, not to demand longer performances, but to depart gracefully when called. By dying naturally, without resistance, he enacted his own metaphor. He played his part with dignity and then stepped aside when dismissed. In this, his death was philosophy embodied. He had taught what he lived, and he lived what he taught, until the very end. For his students, the death of Epictetus must have been both a loss and a confirmation. The man whose words had guided them was gone, but the calmness with which he accepted death validated everything he had taught. They did not need a martyrdom to believe his philosophy. They needed only to remember how he had lived and died with consistency. His departure was a final gift, a reminder that peace is not found in avoiding death, but in welcoming it as part of the whole. For us today, his death circumstances remain meaningful precisely because they resist dramatization. They call us away from the obsession with grand exits and back to the daily practice of wisdom. They remind us that the truest preparation for death is not in the moment itself, but in the life that precedes it. If we live each day with clarity, discipline, and acceptance, then, when death comes, whether quietly or dramatically, we will already be ready. Epictetus's end, humble and unremarkable by historical standards, thus becomes a model of what it means to die well, not by spectacle, but by serenity. The philosopher who once limped through the streets of Rome as a slave, who endured pain, poverty, and exile, ended his life quietly in a home of his own making. His body, once broken, returned to the earth. His words, once spoken in a small school, traveled across centuries. His death circumstances confirm the very paradox of his life. A man who owned nothing left behind a treasure. A man who sought no fame became immortal. A man who died quietly became a voice that still resounds. In the stillness of his final days, Epictetus gave his last and perhaps greatest lesson, that death is not to be feared, dramatized, or resisted, but accepted as the natural close of a role well played. The story of Epictetus does not end with the quiet stillness of his final breath in Nicopolis. In truth, that moment was less an ending than a turning point, the point at which the fragile body of a once enslaved man fell silent, but his voice began to echo across centuries. His legacy has endured not through monuments, titles, or political power, none of which he ever possessed, but through the unyielding clarity of his ideas and the lives they transformed. It is here, in the realm of influence and memory, that the full measure of his greatness emerges. His legacy first lived on in the loyalty of his student Arrian. Without Arrian's devotion, the words of Epictetus might have perished like so many voices of antiquity. But Arrian not only recorded the discourses, but distilled them into the Enchiridion, a handbook compact enough to be carried in the mind and pocket, sharp enough to pierce through centuries of cultural change. Arrian's role was not merely that of a scribe, but of a disciple who recognized that the wisdom he had encountered was too urgent to be lost. The first layer of Epictetus's legacy, then, is the testimony of those who lived close to him, who saw in his life and teaching a truth worth preserving, even when empires shifted and rulers fell. As time passed, his voice reached unexpected audiences. Early Christians, though rooted in a very different worldview, found in his teachings a kinship with their own ideals of detachment, humility, and inner freedom. The Enchiridion was read and copied in monasteries, where monks striving for spiritual discipline recognized in his Stoic exercises a mirror of their own practices of prayer and reflection. His insistence on controlling one's will, on treating external goods as indifferent, and on living in harmony with a higher order resonated deeply with ascetic traditions. In this way, Epictetus became an unwitting teacher of spiritual endurance, far outside the boundaries of Stoicism, his voice blending with other currents to shape the moral imagination of the West. His influence grew even more during the Renaissance. As Europe rediscovered the classical past, humanist scholars turned to Epictetus for a vision of philosophy unburdened by abstraction and directly tied to the art of living. The Enchiridion was translated into multiple languages, passed from scholar to court, from teacher to student. In an age of upheaval, when old certainties were collapsing and new worlds were opening, his emphasis on discipline and clarity offered a compass. The Stoic revival of the Renaissance was not merely intellectual, it was practical, and Epictetus stood at its heart. He became, for many, a guide through turbulence, a reminder that while history's tides cannot be controlled, the inner life can remain free. The Enlightenment, too, found in him a powerful ally. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau admired his rational clarity and his insistence on human dignity. The idea that freedom resides in the will, not in external circumstance, harmonized with their emphasis on autonomy and reason. For Enlightenment thinkers, Epictetus offered a model of freedom stripped of superstition, a moral vision grounded in rational choice. Yet, even as his philosophy was celebrated for its rationalism, some worried that his emphasis on acceptance risked encouraging passivity in the face of injustice. Here again, we see the enduring controversy of his legacy. Does Stoicism teach resignation or resilience? Epictetus continues to provoke debate, and in that debate, his ideas remain alive. His legacy also reached beyond Europe. Muslim scholars encountered his ideas through translations and found echoes with their own traditions of patience, sabr, and trust in divine order, tawakkul. In China, Jesuit missionaries carried Stoic texts, and parallels were drawn with Confucian and Taoist ideals of harmony, duty, and detachment. Though these encounters were often indirect, they reveal the universality of his insights. Wherever human beings wrestle with control, loss, and freedom, Epictetus's words find a home. His legacy became not merely Western but human, part of a shared global dialogue on how to live well. The modern age discovered in Epictetus something even more unexpected: the seeds of psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most widely practiced forms of psychotherapy today, is built on the insight that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. This principle is lifted directly from Epictetus's teaching. Psychologists like Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck explicitly acknowledge their debt to him. In therapy rooms across the world, patients who may never have heard of Stoicism are taught to reframe their thoughts, to distinguish between what they can and cannot control, to free themselves from destructive patterns. In this way, the voice of Epictetus lives on not only in philosophy classrooms, but in the healing of modern minds. His legacy also reached soldiers, leaders, and ordinary people. The Enchiridion was carried by generals into battle, providing counsel in the face of fear. Admiral James Stockdale, a prisoner of war in Vietnam for over 7 years, credited Epictetus with sustaining him through torture and isolation. Stockdale carried the Enchiridion in his mind when he could not carry it in his hands, repeating its maxims as a shield against despair. In him, we see the ancient slave speaking across centuries to a modern prisoner, both bound by chains yet free in spirit. Few legacies are as powerful as this, that the words of one broken body could preserve another under unimaginable trial. Beyond soldiers and scholars, Epictetus's legacy endures in the quiet lives of countless individuals who encounter his words in moments of crisis. A grieving parent finds in his counsel the strength to accept loss without collapsing. A worker facing instability discovers the freedom of distinguishing between what is theirs and what is not. A person caught in the swirl of modern anxieties learns that serenity is not found in controlling the storm, but in mastering the self. These everyday applications are the truest measure of his legacy. His philosophy was never meant for elites alone, but for anyone willing to practice it, and its survival in ordinary lives proves its timeless relevance. Epictetus sought nothing of fame, wrote nothing of his own, built no monuments, commanded no armies, and held no office. By every external measure, his life should have been forgotten. And yet, his words have outlasted emperors, his influence has crossed continents, and his presence continues to shape lives. This paradox is the vindication of his teaching. External power and wealth do not define greatness. True greatness lies in the cultivation of the will, in the integrity of one's living. Epictetus's legacy is itself proof of Stoicism's truth. What makes his legacy especially enduring is its adaptability. His words have spoken across cultures, religions, and centuries precisely because they address what is universal: the inevitability of loss, the limits of control, the hunger for freedom. While empires crumble and ideologies shift, these realities remain constant. Epictetus did not tie his wisdom to the politics of his time, but to the structure of human life itself. That is why his voice still feels fresh, why his Enchiridion can sit on a bedside table today as readily as it could in a Roman soldier's satchel. His legacy does not fade because it rests on truths that do not change. In the end, the lasting legacy of Epictetus is not simply in the preservation of texts or the admiration of scholars, but in the transformation of lives. He gave the world a philosophy that requires no wealth, no power, no privilege to practice, only the courage to face reality and the discipline to govern oneself. His life proves that dignity is possible in chains, that freedom is possible in exile, that peace is possible in poverty. His words prove that philosophy is not a matter of speculation, but of survival, not an ornament of culture, but a companion in hardship. Thus, the legacy of Epictetus is not contained in history, but alive in the present. It is the legacy of a man who had nothing yet gave everything, who wrote nothing yet left behind volumes, who sought obscurity yet became immortal. His voice still whispers to us across the centuries: you cannot control the world, but you can control yourself. Live this truth, and you will be free. And in those words lies not only his enduring legacy, but also the invitation for each of us to carry it forward.